Chapter 654. Long Yang and Zhu Yan couldn't help but worry about Emo Xiaoyao's intentions. After receiving the news from Lei Tingfeng that many troops of the Mahist army had secretly left, their worries became a reality. Zhu Yan sat in the chair and was silent for a long time. He sighed and said, "Well, it's really the Mahist army." Looking at the two old generals' expressions, Lei Tingfeng also knew that things had changed. He asked worriedly, "Old general, what happened?" Zhu Yan and Long Yang looked at each other and finally told him what had happened. At this time it didn't make any sense to hide this kind of thing. After listening to Long Yang and Zhu Yan, Lei Tingfeng was also shocked. "General Zhu, you mean, you still have hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers in your hands?" Speaking of this, he couldn't help but look at Long Yang next to him with surprise. In the past 20 years, the Lord of Jinnan's mansion had been carefully monitoring Zhu Yan, who lived in Bian City. In the past 20 years he had never contacted his former subordinates, and even in Bian City he rarely went out. Lei Tingfeng was almost completely at ease with him, but he didn't expect that the other party was actually secretly holding on to an army of more than 100,000 elite soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and horses looked insignificant in West Hill's total military strength of nearly 3 million and could be increased at any time. But if used on the edge of a knife, it was very terrible. For example, in the past 20 years his father had come to Bian City several times. Zhu Yan suddenly attacked at that time. Lei Tingfeng's heart trembled and he didn't dare to think about it anymore. He finally understood why his father had always been on guard against these old generals. It was said that the civil officials and powerful officials disrupted the government, but the ones who could really change the dynasty and usurp the throne were generally military generals. Without military power, everything was just empty talk. As if he understood what Lei Tingfeng was thinking, Long Yang snorted and said, "This elite army was personally given to Zhu Yan by the late emperor. Even the current emperor has no right to take it back. Why should Jinnan Palace know? What's more, this elite troop was originally prepared to guard against the Prince Ding mansion." Lei Tingfeng remained silent. He believed Long Yang's words. However, there were some things that couldn't be solved just by believing. But now was not the time to discuss this matter. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers. What's the use of fighting against the Mahist army? Idiot. Zhu Yan snorted and said, "The late emperor was wise and farsighted. He knew that the Mahist army was the biggest enemy of the West Hill. Therefore he had long prepared a bargaining chip to deal with the Mahist army. If not for the sudden death of the late emperor, how could he have? There was also Lei Jinting. Back then the Prince Ding mansion suffered a great loss. In order to eliminate his dissidents, he had wasted a great opportunity. It was only because the snake was not killed that the Mo family's army arrived at the city gates today." Lei Tingfeng was speechless. When the Mahist army suffered a great loss and Mo Xiao was seriously injured and dying, it was the time when the royalists in the West Hill were the most active. In order to attack these people, his father gave up a great opportunity to attack the Dechu state. However, at that time who really believed that Mo Xiao could stand up again? Even if they didn't participate in the poisoning of Mo Xiao, it didn't mean that they didn't know anything. "Old general, what should we do now?" Lei Tingfeng saw that the atmosphere was not right, so he quickly turned the topic back and asked. Zhu Yan sighed and said, "Old Long, you helped the crown prince to defend the city. I'll go and meet the famous Prince Ding." Long Yang frowned. He was a few years older than Zhu Yan, but Zhu Yan was not young either. It was too dangerous to go out of the city in person. Zhu Yan waved his hand and said, "It doesn't matter. I can still move. You're right. I can't just watch Mo Xiao devour my hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers." Long Yang also knew that this was the best choice. He sighed and said, "Well, you be careful. I'll hold back some of the Mahist army for you in the city. Take care. Take care." The two white-haired old men looked at each other and solemnly said goodbye. Zhu Yan turned and left. His slightly trembling body seemed to straighten up in an instant. Long Yang looked at his friend's figure and closed his eyes. He told Lei Tingfeng beside him, "Go and get ready. We'll go out of the city to fight." It was already the afternoon of the third day. The Mahist army under the city wall kept shouting and cursing. The West Hill defenders on the city wall also did not stay idle. They also unceremoniously returned the curses. The two countries came from the same origin and there were no cultural differences. There was no obstacle in cursing. If they were cursing with Nanzhao and Beirong, most of the people would not understand. In front of the army, Yun Ting and Qin Yun rode side by side, looking at the distant city tower. Yun Ting said anxiously, "Aren't Long Yong and Zhu Yan the famous generals of West Hill? Why are they hiding like turtles?" Qin Yun shrugged helplessly. How would he know? Don't tell me they want to stall for time? Stall for time until Lei Jinting comes back to help? Qin Yun said with some uncertainty. Don't joke. When Lei Jinting arrives, it will be a month later at the earliest. Yun Ting said. They only had 3 days. Now the 3 days were almost up and they had not even touched the edge of Bian City's city tower. In the past 3 days they had tried all kinds of methods such as strong attacks and sneak attacks. But they had to admit that it was reasonable for the old general to come out. They could not find a loophole in Bian City's defense. Such a blow made the young general's faces more and more ugly day by day. At this time Yun Ting's face was still green. In fact, if Yun Ting knew that not only him, but even his prince's wife could not find a loophole in Bian City's defense, he would not be so depressed. Look, are they coming out? Qin Yun pointed to the fluttering flag on the wall. Obviously there were people and horses moving very quickly. Yun Ting's eyes narrowed and a sneer appeared on his young face. Zhu Yan. Brothers continued to scold him. The Mahist army behind him once again loudly greeted Zhu Yan's 8 generations of ancestors and relatives. Long Yong led people to appear on the wall, squinting at the young man who was showing off under the city wall. He smiled and said, "Young man, tell me your name." Yun Ting said proudly, "I am Yun Ting, the Deputy General of the Eagle Army of the Mahist Army's 9th Division." Long Yong was stunned. Such an obviously different organization from the General Army made him unable to determine Yun Ting's identity for a while. But from Yun Ting's age he could guess a thing or two. Such a young and high-spirited young man, 80% could not be the general of an army. He looked at Yun Ting with a smile and said, "Where is the general of the Mahist army? Or is there no one in the Mahist army?" Yun Ting was not happy. He looked up at the old man on the wall and said, "I am the general. It's just Bian City, I don't need to trouble others. I will let you see the ability of the Mahist army." Long Yong was not angry, as if he was looking at an ignorant child. He smiled and said, "What? Then let me see the ability of the young general of the Mahist army." "I am not Zhu Yan." Long Yong. Yun Ting gnashed his teeth. Chapter 655. Indeed, the older the wiser. Yun Ting was already at a disadvantage even before the battle started. They had only exchanged a few words. Below the city tower, the originally closed city gate suddenly opened, and the drawbridge over the moat was lowered. The West Hill soldiers who had been hiding in the city rushed out like a tide towards the Mahist army. These days not only were the Mahist army soldiers sullen, but also the soldiers brought by Lei Tingfeng as reinforcements. Being insulted by the enemy without being able to charge down and kill them was the greatest humiliation as a soldier. Now that they could finally leave the city, these soldiers naturally rushed towards the Mahist army soldiers who had been showing off in front of them for the past few days. The battle was on the verge of breaking out. For a moment the sound of war drums and killing filled the sky outside the city. On the city tower, Long Yong calmly looked at the killing below the city. Whether it was the Mahist army or the Shilling army, their fighting power could be said to be quite good. Therefore when the strong met, the killing was naturally very intense. Long Yong looked at the young white-robed general below the city with a faint smile. He raised his hand and waved the small red flag in his hand. The West Hill soldiers in grey armor quickly changed their formation under the guidance of the flag. Standing on the city tower they could clearly see the entire battlefield. The Black Missouri Family Army camp was quickly surrounded and split apart by the grey tide of people, before being destroyed one by one. Yun Ting's reaction was not slow. He also ordered the formation as quickly as possible. However, he was still one step behind Long Yong. The Shilling army's formation changed again. Like a grey dragon, it was wantonly killing the Mahist army. Although the Mahist army was brave, the battlefield was not something that could be solved by a single soldier's bravery. When a Mahist army soldier faced 3 West Hill soldiers at the same time, when a small team of Mahist army soldiers was surrounded by a large team of West Hill soldiers, Yun Ting could only watch as the soldiers around him fell one by one in front of him. He abruptly turned around and saw the white-clothed old man standing on the city wall. He was dressed in plain clothes and looked like an inconspicuous villager. However, the confidence and arrogance in the old man's eyes revealed that he was not an ordinary person. Yun-Ting shouldn't have been able to see the other party's expression from such a distance. However, Yun-Ting clearly felt that he was as insignificant as an ant in the other party's eyes. Yun-Ting, what are you doing? Charge out. Qin Yun kicked away the stunned Yun-Ting. An arrow narrowly missed the spot where Yun-Ting was originally standing. Qin Yun glared at him in annoyance. How dare you daydream on the battlefield? You must be tired of living. Yun-Ting came back to his senses. At that moment he was so intimidated by Long Yang's aura that he forgot that he was on the battlefield. Yun-Ting dodged the sword that came slashing at him. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead. This was the true power of the god of slaughter of the western region. The sound of the retreat was heard from behind. The Mahist army no longer lingered in the battle and broke through the Shilling army's encirclement to kill their way out. However, the Mahist army retreated in a sorry state that they had never been in for many years. On the city wall, Long Yang also signaled for the retreat of the Mahist army after seeing them retreat. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "General, why don't we pursue them?" Long Yang said calmly, "Today was just a test. It seems that the Mahist army has indeed split up. Just now, the Mahist army was about to be defeated, but no one came to help. Instead they retreated. Then, don't worry. We'll test them again tomorrow," Long Yang said in a low voice. After losing the battle, Yun-Ting and his men returned to the camp dejectedly and prepared to ask for forgiveness from the prince's consort. However, Zhuojing, who was guarding outside the tent, told him that the prince's consort had something to do. All the military affairs were temporarily handed over to Qin Yun and Yun-Ting. Yun-Ting was so frightened that he almost fell to the ground. Qin Yun, who was behind him, was also pale. It was not that they looked down on themselves, but with their experience, they were not even qualified to command an army. How could they command the entire Mahist army? The two of them looked at each other and broke out in cold sweat. Yun-Ting looked at Zhuojing for help. Zhuojing shrugged and patted Yun-Ting's shoulder helplessly. "Since the prince ordered you to do so, it means that he trusts your abilities. Don't worry. But we just lost the battle," Yun-Ting said shamefully. He had thought that he would be punished by military law for not completing the task given by the prince. But in the current situation, it would be better to be punished by military law. Zhuojing smiled calmly. "You almost lost just now. You haven't lost yet, have you?" He gave the two of them a look that said, "I have faith in you." Zhuojing turned and went back to the battle. Yun-Ting wanted to cry but had no tears. "If you hadn't retreated just now, I might have died on the battlefield." 100 miles southwest of Bian City was a small county town. The entire county town was less than 1/10 the size of Bian City, but its location was on the official road between the city of the Emperor of Shilling and Bian City. In other words, if the troops from the west wanted to reach Bian City as quickly as possible, they would have to pass through here. 3 days ago, Zhang Qilon was ordered by Mo Xiuyao to lead 70,000 troops to occupy this small town. Because Shiling's main defense was Bian City, such a small town's military strength was naturally weak. Zhang Qilon almost effortlessly took over this small town. Then the 70,000 troops were stationed in this small town, seemingly doing nothing. But Zhang Qilon knew that there was a group of more than 100,000 elite troops nearby. Even though the Mahist army had sent out their most elite troops, Qilin, they still couldn't find their specific location. But Zhang Qilon knew that they were hiding in the mountains about 30 miles away. It wasn't wise for the Mahist army to enter the mountains with their military strength, so Zhang Qilon waited here. If this group of troops wanted to approach Bian City, they would have to pass by him. He wasn't in a hurry. Not far from the small town, on a small road that deviated from the official road, a group of Mahist army soldiers were chasing a group of people. There were only 5 people in this group. 4 men were protecting a young girl in plain clothes as they fought and retreated. Although the 4 men were skilled, there were too many soldiers chasing them. Moreover, the Mahist army soldiers weren't ordinary people. The 4 of them were already covered in wounds, but they didn't forget to protect the young girl in the middle. "Miss, hurry and leave. We'll block them. Go to the capital to find." One of the men used force to push the young girl towards the narrow road in front of them. Unfortunately, before he could finish his words, he was stabbed in the abdomen and fell to the ground. The remaining 3 didn't have time to look at their companions. One of them pulled the young girl and ran forward, while the other 2 stayed behind to block the Mahist army soldiers chasing them. The 2 of them ran wildly. Unfortunately, they didn't run far before the young girl fell to the ground, gasping for breath. "I can't walk any. You guys go." "No. Miss, hurry and leave. You must return to the capital. Don't forget, the general wants you to live well," the guard said sternly, pulling the young girl towards the side of the road into the forest. Not long after, the footsteps of the soldiers chasing them could be heard. It was obvious that the 2 guards who stayed behind had died in battle. Chapter 656. The 2 of them hid in the thistles and thorns in the forest, and the pursuing soldiers found that they had lost track of them. Some of them searched for nearly an hour, using their swords and spears to randomly stab and hack at the thorny bushes that could hide people. In the end, they still couldn't find any trace of the 2 people. Only then did they gradually leave, taking the bodies of the dead guards back to receive their rewards. The forest gradually quieted down, and after a long time, the thistles and bushes on the side of the road moved. A young girl in a sorry state crawled out from the bushes and pushed the person beside her. "Wake up! Wake up!" Her slender white hands were covered in blood, and the young girl was so frightened that she immediately cried out. It turned out that when the soldiers were searching, the guard used his body to block the swords that were slashing at the bushes. There was a long wound on his back that was continuously bleeding, and he had already fallen unconscious. The pale young girl looked at the desolate wilderness in front of her and the only person she could rely on who was unconscious. She finally could not help but cry. In the midst of her drowsy crying, she vaguely saw a moon-white figure appear in front of her. The young girl raised her head in confusion. "Save me." The young man wearing moon-white clothes silently looked at the man and woman who had already fainted in front of him, a pair of sword-like eyebrows on his handsome face slightly wrinkled. He lowered his head to look at the man's injuries. The numerous wounds on his body and the almost fatal stab on his back were enough to show that the man had experienced a difficult battle. Although the young girl was wearing ordinary cotton clothes, her beautiful face and slender hands were enough to show that she should have been pampered and spoiled since childhood. Originally, he could have saved them, and even the guards who had died, he could have saved them. But his special identity meant that he had to think twice before he acted. So he had been secretly watching the guards die one by one, watching the young girl cry helplessly in the wilderness. "Young master, what should we do?" the guard following behind him asked in a low voice. The man was silent for a moment and then said, "I just heard the guard say something about a general." "Which general's daughter is she?" The guard shook his head and said, "This subordinate does not know. Presumably, she is the daughter of a general who was defeated by the Mahist army." The man thought for a moment and said, "See if they have any tokens on them." The guard stepped forward and squatted down. Very quickly he found a piece of cloth from the unconscious guard's body. Then he took a purple jade bracelet from the girl's wrist and respectfully handed it to the handsome man in white. The man took it and looked at it. He frowned and said, "It's the imperial bodyguard of the Tiger General Yang Hu." This purple jade bracelet was a tribute from the western regions during the previous emperor's reign. The previous emperor bestowed it to the Grand Preceptor. Lord Ling Hui's wife is Lord Ling's daughter. The guard said in a low voice, "So, this lady is the daughter of the Hui general?" General Hui, who was stationed in Li City, had passed away 10 days ago. The man pondered for a long time before finally saying, "Bring him back." In the hidden depths of the mountains there were many courtyards and houses. Under the cover of the dense forest and perennial clouds, it was almost impossible for outsiders to find any trace of it. In a simple and crude room, a sleeping girl seemed to have suddenly woken up from a nightmare and sat down abruptly. Then she saw a handsome young man sitting not far away from her. "Shut up," the young man said in a low voice. The girl hid in the innermost part of the bed in fear and wrapped herself tightly in the blanket. "Who are you?" the young man said in a low voice. "I should be the one asking you that. Who are you?" The girl bit her red lips and refused to speak. "Where did Alin go?" "He's still." The girl trembled as if she did not dare to continue asking. The man said calmly, "He's still alive if that's what you want to ask." Hearing this, the girl sighed in relief. That's good. You saved us?" The man did not deny it. Instead he asked lightly, "Who are you?" My name is Yang Xinya. My father is the Tiger General. My father. As she spoke, the girl's eyes reddened. Crystal clear tears fell from the corners of her eyes, and she slowly sobbed. The man frowned slightly and sighed. I know the Tiger General died in battle 10 days ago. Did he ask the guards to escort you out? The girl Yang Xinya nodded. She bit her lips and said in a low voice, Before Li City fell, my father had already asked people to escort me back to the capital. Originally there were 12 of them. But now, there's only Lin left. The man frowned and thought for a moment before asking, Why did the Mahist army pursue you so relentlessly? Although she was the daughter of the Tiger General, she was not that important to the Mahist army. This kind of relentless pursuit was very unreasonable. The girl shook her head in confusion. I don't know. My father only told me to go back to the capital to find my uncle. The man stood up and said, I understand. Rest well. When you're better, I'll send someone to escort you back to the capital. Then he turned and walked out. Xinya still doesn't know your name. I'll definitely repay you for saving my life when I return to the capital, the girl said in a low voice. The man paused and said lightly, Zhu Ling. When the man went out, the guards were already waiting outside. When they saw him come out, they quickly greeted him. Young master, we've already checked. The late Grand Tutor Ling's daughter married the Tiger General and had only one daughter. General Yang and his wife loved this daughter very much. It's not an exaggeration to say that they doted on her. Now Lord Ling, who is Miss Yang's uncle, also treats this niece as his own. It's said that Miss Yang is 17 this year and has been engaged to her cousin, the Ling family's eldest son, since she was young. If it weren't for the sudden attack from the northwest, General Yang would have brought his daughter back to the capital to hold the wedding. The man nodded. I've already asked, and it's pretty much the same as what you said. The guard asked, Then, can her words be trusted? Zhu Ling said, Let her stay first. Grandfather has a good relationship with the Ling family. If she's really the Ling family's granddaughter and we don't save her, we won't be able to explain it to the Ling family. Send someone to watch over them. Yes, young master. Chapter 657. The mountains were shrouded in clouds and mist all year round, so it was rare to see direct sunlight even on normal days. Thus, in the western hill where most of the land was relatively dry, this mountain range was a rare moist and green place. At the entrance of the small courtyard, a delicate and pale girl was stopped before she could reach the door. Who is it? Yang Xinya was startled and said with some trepidation, I want to check on Lin's injuries. The guard standing at the entrance of the courtyard was expressionless, as if he was not moved by the weak girl in front of him. Young master has instructed Miss to recuperate in the courtyard. Guard Lin will naturally come and meet Miss when he has recovered. Yang Xinya bit her lips and said in a low voice, But I'm very worried. I don't know anyone around me. Only him. I beg you, let me go see him. Seeing the girl crying pitifully in front of them, the two guards were somewhat hesitant. After all, the young master had brought her back and ordered them to take good care of her. Miss, please wait. We will go and report to the young master. In the end, the guards could only compromise. What happened? Yang Xinya was about to thank them when Zhu Ling's voice came from outside the door. The guards hurriedly bowed and stood side by side. Yang Xinya was about to explain what happened to her guard. Zhu Ling raised his eyebrows and looked at the pale girl with a trace of panic in front of him, deep in thought. Yang Xinya asked carefully, Young Master Zhu, how is Lin's injuries? When can we return to the capital? Zhu Gongzi, please send someone to escort the two of us back to the capital. When we return to the capital, my daughter and the Ling family will be grateful to you. Zhu Ling's eyes flashed and he looked at Yang Xinya with a gentler expression. He smiled faintly and said, Don't worry, Miss Yang. When you recover, I will send someone to escort you back to the capital. However, Guard Lin's injuries are not light. I'm afraid he will have to lie down for a few days. Yang Xinya sighed in relief and nodded, Thank you, young Master Zhu. It's good that Lin is fine. May I go see him? Zhu Ling smiled. Miss Yang can just look at him from the door. It's best not to look at his injuries. This one has already sent someone back to the capital to deliver a letter to young Master Ling. Perhaps it won't be long before young Master Ling personally comes to pick up Miss Yang. Hearing this, Yang Xinya showed a trace of joy and relief. That's great, thank you, young Master Zhu. Young Master Zhu is indeed a good person. Zhu Ling smiled faintly. Not at all, Miss Yang is the descendant of valiant bravery. These matters are only a small matter for this one. After comforting Yang Xinya, who was worried about the guards, and sending her back to her room, Zhu Ling left the small courtyard and went to the outer courtyard. Although this courtyard built in the middle of the mountain forest was particularly simple compared to other courtyards in the city, it still had 2 entrances, and the study was in the corner of the outer courtyard. After entering the study, the guard behind him said, "Young master, it seems that this Miss Yang is indeed the daughter of the Hu general. Just now, young master said that young Master Ling was coming, but I didn't see her acting strangely." Zhu Ling nodded and sat down behind the desk. He said tiredly, "This is a special period. It is always good to be careful. Has the guard called Alin woken up?" The guard nodded and said, "He just woke up not long ago. His injuries are too serious. The knife on his back almost took his life." The situation he described is similar to what Miss Yang said. When the Mahist army first entered Li City, General Yang arranged for more than 10 people to escort Miss Yang back to the capital to join the Ling family. However, they didn't expect the Mahist army to attack the city so quickly. They had just left Li City when the city fell. When they disguised themselves as normal people and passed by the small county that Zhang Qilan took over, they accidentally exposed their identities and were chased by the Mahist army. Zhu Ling frowned and nodded. It seems that this Alin is still loyal. Have the doctor use the best medicine and heal his injuries as soon as possible. Yes, young master. Is there any news from grandfather? Changing the topic, Zhu Ling asked about serious matters. The guard's expression also became more worried. He shook his head and said, "No, ever since Bian City was surrounded by the Mahist army, there has been no news from the old general. Zhang Qilan is guarding the county, and anyone who goes in and out has to go through strict checks. I'm afraid that even if the old general wanted to send a letter, he wouldn't be able to. Young master, are we going to hide here forever? Are we going to let Zhang Qilan occupy the main road in and out of Bian City? Although Bian City has abundant reserves, if it is continuously surrounded for 1 or 2 months, it will still be a bit difficult." Zhu Ling thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, Emo Shuyao won't do that. He's in a hurry. After 1 or 2 months, the reinforcements from all over Xiling will be able to reach Bian City. At that time, his mere 400,000 soldiers, no matter how powerful they are, will be like a dragon in shallow water or a tiger in the plains." "Young master, you mean?" Zhu Ling frowned and said, "Emo Shuyao doesn't have many soldiers to begin with. At this time he can still divide tens of thousands of soldiers to occupy a small county. I suspect he already knows of our existence." The guard was also shocked and said, "Prince Ding sent Zhang Qilan to guard Bian City to prevent us from reinforcing Bian City and outflanking him." Zhu Ling raised his hand and pressed between his eyebrows and said, "I'm more inclined to think that he wants Zhang Qilan to annihilate us." "How is that possible?" The guard snorted and said in disbelief, "Not to mention that we are familiar with the terrain here, which is far from what the Mahist army can compare to. In terms of military strength, Zhang Qilan's mere tens of thousands of soldiers and horses are not our opponents." Zhu Ling shook his head and sighed. "Emo Shuyao won't do anything useless. Send people down the mountain to investigate the situation of Bian City and the Mahist army." "Yes, young master." 2 days later, Zhu Ling was sitting in the study and playing chess with Yang Xinya. After a few days of interaction, the girl's initial fear and uneasiness had finally faded. Especially after knowing that Zhu Ling was the grandson of the old General Zhu Yan, she was completely relieved. Although she was still young and had never seen the old General Zhu Yan, she had heard her grandfather and uncles mention him. The Zhu family and the Ling family also had some friendship. The girl, whose fear and uneasiness had faded away, gradually became cheerful. Only then did Zhu Ling realize that the girl was not like ordinary West Hill women who were not good at zither, chess, calligraphy, or painting. On the contrary, she was good at calligraphy and painting. Although he had never heard of her playing the zither, her chess skills were also very good. She was completely unlike the so-called tigress of a general's family. But thinking that General Yang's wife was the daughter of the former Grand Preceptor of West Hill, which could be said to be one of the most famous scholarly families in West Hill, all of this made sense. Although Zhu Ling was born in a general's family, he grew up in a place like Bian City. Longshan Academy, one of the 3 major academies in the world, was located in Bian City. Zhu Ling grew up under the guidance of a famous scholar. However, due to many reasons, he could only stay in such a mountain forest all year round with these illiterate soldiers. Now, it was rare to meet a talented person. Even if it was a girl, it was enough for the two to have a good conversation. "Young master, I have something to report," someone outside the door reported loudly. Chapter 658. Zhu Ling looked at the girl, who was deep in thought, and said lightly, "Come in." The person outside the door came in and looked at Yang Xinya with some hesitation. Yang Xinya stood up and said, "Young master, Xinya will leave first. We can continue the game in the future. I'll go see Ao Lin." Zhu Ling's eyes were gentle as he nodded. "That's good. Guard Lin will be able to get out of bed in a few days. You don't have to worry." "I know. Thank you, young master." Yang Xinya thanked Zhu Ling again before leaving. Watching the girl's slender figure disappear at the door, Zhu Ling looked down at the unfinished game in front of him, lost in thought. "Young master?" The guard in front of him called out with some confusion. Zhu Ling came back to his senses and asked, "What happened?" The guard said, "These days the Maoist army has surrounded Bian City, but they haven't carried out a large-scale attack. Instead, they've only sent a few small generals to shout outside the city and casually fight for a while before retreating back to the camp. In the Maoist army, there hasn't been a single general under Mo Xiuyao who can take charge of an area. In addition, when the 2 armies were fighting yesterday, the old general led 70,000 men out of the city and came to our side. I'm afraid he wants to deal with Zhang Qilon first." Zhu Ling was startled and frowned. The generals under Mo Xiuyao didn't appear on the battlefield? "But there's only one Zhang Qilon here. Where did the others go?" The guard said, "The Maoist army secretly took some men out of the camp. The old general suspects that the Maoist army already knows of our existence. They plan to surround Bian City on the surface, but concentrate most of their forces to deal with us. I'm afraid the old general is worried, so he came to help us." Zhu Ling closed his eyes. "Who's guarding Bian City?" "General Long Yang is also in Bian City." "That's good." "No, that's not right. Mo Xiuyao doesn't want to deal with us. He wants to lure grandfather out of the city." Suddenly thinking of something, Zhu Ling's face changed and he stood up abruptly. "Mo Xiuyao didn't appear in the Maoist army camp, nor is he with Zhang Qilon. Must be hidden somewhere else. If we don't show up, he won't be able to find us. He wants to lure grandfather out of the city, and then slowly deplete Bian City's military strength." Hearing this, the guard's expression changed greatly. "Young master, what should we do?" Zhu Ling said solemnly, "Pass down the order. Send troops to attack Zhang Qilon's forces. We must take down the county town before tomorrow morning so that we can help grandfather." This subordinate will go right away. Deep into the night, the quiet mountains seemed especially quiet tonight. In the courtyard hidden in the night, a slender figure briskly swept out. She avoided the night patrol guards and nimbly entered the secret study in the corner of the front yard. Even tonight, most of the soldiers in the forest had left, but the outside of the study was still heavily guarded. Shadow approached silently like a phantom. By the time the 4 guards outside the door reacted, 3 of them had already fallen to the ground. "It's you?" Whoosh. A dagger flew out and nailed itself into the heart of the last person. "Lin Han," Shadow said in a low voice. Under the eaves, a tall and straight voice quietly fell. He walked over and looked at the 4 corpses on the ground without the slightest ripple in his eyes. "Princess." The person who came was the guard of the Huwei general's manor, Ao Lin, who was supposed to be lying on the bed and unable to get up. "Is the injury serious?" Yang Xinya Yili asked softly. Lin Han said in a low voice, "It avoided the vital parts, so it's not serious. It just looks serious." Yili nodded. "It's good that you're fine. Watch me, I'll go in and take a look." "Yes." Yili entered the study and came out after a while. Soon the 2 figures disappeared from the courtyard. Not long after, a dazzling firework broke through the heavy fog and the night, blooming in the night sky of the mountains. When the sky was about to brighten, the battle in the small county town officially began. This small town was not as sturdy as Bian City. The height and thickness of the city walls were far less than Bian City. There were even some places that didn't have city walls at all. It was much more difficult to defend such a small town than to enter the palace. Therefore Zhu Ling and his men almost didn't encounter much resistance and attacked the city. They fought fiercely with the generals of the Mahist army in the city. In a hidden corner of the city, Zhang Qilan stood on a high place with his subordinates and watched the battle in the city. His subordinate whispered, "General, the other side is estimated to have nearly 100,000 people. We should withdraw." Zhang Qilan shook his head and said, "No, according to the information given to us by the princess, the other side has at least 180,000 people. But this county town is too small. Hundreds of thousands of people can't be used at all. It's impossible for the other side to bring out all their forces." The general whispered. Zhang Qilan glanced at him angrily and said, "Of course I know this. Don't you see that there are less than 100,000 people and there's almost no space left? Tell the boys on the periphery to secretly withdraw. Those who have joined the battle fight for me. Delay them. We must delay until Zhu Yan's men arrive." Hearing this, the general said with a bitter face, "If so, we really have no way to survive. Hundreds of thousands of people were enough for them. How could they survive if tens of thousands of people and an old general who had been on the battlefield came?" Zhang Qilan patted his subordinate's shoulder with a smile and said, "Are you afraid? Don't be afraid. I'm with you. Even if there's no way to survive, we can drag a famous general of West Hill down with us. It's not a loss." The general stared and said loudly, "Who's afraid? I don't want to be buried with Zhu Yan. I want to follow the prince to conquer the world." Zhang Qilan laughed and said, "It's good that you have this courage. I think highly of you." But while they were talking, flames appeared in the east outside the city. Zhang Qilan took a deep breath and said, "They're coming." Zhu Yan came so fast that they had just seen the torches and rushed to the city gate. The gate of the small county town was vulnerable. The Mahist army didn't have so many soldiers to defend the city tower. Not long after, the east gate was broken by the soldiers of West Hill. The Mahist army was sandwiched in the middle by the enemy from the west and the east. Zhang Qilan looked at the bright sky and said with some regret, "It's time to retreat." When the golden horn sounded, the Mahist army did not have the slightest desire to fight and left quickly. The soldiers of West Hill had been sullen these days. Seeing the Mahist army fleeing, they wanted to go forward and chase after them. But they were stopped by Zhu Yan. "Don't chase. There may be a trap ahead," Zhu Ling said. Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Yes. The Mahist army's retreat seems to be chaotic, but there's order in the chaos. It's not a sign of defeat. I'm afraid that they want to lure us in." After ordering the soldiers to clean up the battlefield, Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan had time to talk alone. Because of Zhu Yan's identity and Zhu Ling's heavy responsibility, Zhu Ling stayed in the mountains all year round. Therefore Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan rarely saw each other. The last time they saw each other was more than half a year ago. Looking at his grandson who stood tall and firm in front of him, Zhu Yan nodded with relief. At the same time he felt very guilty for his grandson. In order to take charge of the army for him, his grandson could only stay in the mountains all year round. This child was his only relative and also his most beloved junior. Sometimes Zhu Yan even wondered if everything he had insisted on was worth it. Chapter 659. "Good boy, thank you for your hard work." Looking at Zhu Ling, Zhu Yan whispered after a long time. Zhu Ling smiled faintly and said, "Grandfather, you are too serious. This is what I should do. By the way, why did grandfather take the army out of the city? The defense of Bian City." Zhu Yan waved his hand and said, "I know Imo Xiuyao wants to lure me out. But Longyang is in Bian City, so it doesn't matter if I am there or not. But your side. I don't know why I am always a little worried. Especially these 2 days, I always feel frightened when I think about it. What's the matter on your side?" Zhu Ling shook his head and said, "I am fine. Grandfather, you are too worried. His grandson will be careful in everything. Since grandfather came out, there is also a benefit. We can stay here and cooperate with General Longyang to restrict the speed of the Mahist army's attack. What's more, we have more than 600,000 troops on both sides. Imo Xiuyao has less than 400,000 troops. Are we afraid of him?" Zhu Ling would not ignore his grandfather's worry. It was not the general suspicion of the old man, but the instinctive premonition of danger of an old general. Zhu Yan patted his grandson's shoulder and said, "Good boy, you have grown up." In the face of his grandfather's praise, even the calm Zhu Ling could not help but smile. The grandfather and grandson sat down and exchanged views on the current situation. Zhu Yan was even more happy about his grandson's growth. When Zhu Yan said that he saved Yang Xinya, Zhu Yan frowned and said, "You said that she is the daughter of the late Hui general. Are you sure?" Zhu Ling was stunned and said, "Of course I am sure. She has a lot of tokens and the waist tokens of the guards around her. In addition, I asked her a lot about Hui general and the Ling family and there were no flaws." Suddenly there was a bad feeling in his heart. Zhu Ling's face changed slightly and he looked at Zhu Yan uneasily. Zhu Yan frowned and said, "You are right. That girl's temperament and appearance are a bit like Hui general's daughter. But 2 years ago when Hui general took his wife and daughter to Li City, he visited me in Bian City. The girl of the Yang family has been spoiled since childhood, and her temperament is like Hui general. She doesn't like music, chess, calligraphy and painting. Other than needlework, which was slightly better, she only knew a few words. I don't even know how to play chess." Then, Zhu Ling's expression immediately turned ugly. In the beginning he was also on guard against Yang Xinya. Even now he didn't let her know anything important. But after several probing he really recognized Yang Xinya's identity. Now that he suddenly found out that the other party's identity was a scam, the anger in his heart could be imagined. "Grandfather, I have to go back immediately. I'm afraid." Zhu Yan's expression also became dignified. At this time, a woman of unknown origin who claimed to be the daughter of General Hui suddenly appeared. How could he not feel uneasy? After thinking for a while, Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Okay, go ahead. Be careful." "Yes, grandfather, you too, old general, young master. We've been surrounded by the Mahist army." The soldier outside hurried in and reported. In fact, even if he didn't report, Zhu Yan and Zhu Ling already knew. Before his voice died away, there was a deafening sound of war drums outside the city. The two hurried out and climbed up the tower. They saw the flags fluttering under the city. The Mahist army soldiers were holding weapons and waiting for battle. The formation was solemn and they didn't look like they fled half an hour ago. In front of the army, Zhang Qilon stood straight and laughed loudly. "Old General Zhu. I, Zhang Qilon, the commander of the Mahist Army's Eagle Army, have long heard of old General Zhu's name. Please enlighten me." Zhu Yan looked around. The black mass of the Mahist army in front of him had at least hundreds of thousands of people. Zhang Qilon wasn't an inexperienced general like Yun Ting and Chen Yun. With a wave of his hand, the soldiers of the Mo family army scattered in all directions. Although it looked like a mess, if one were to look closely, they would be able to see the profoundness behind it. If ordinary generals rashly entered the formation of chaotic heaven, they wouldn't be able to rush out without a considerable number of soldiers. Zhu Ling's expression changed slightly. Apparently he also saw the beauty of this formation. He said to Zhu Yan, "Grandfather, I'll go and have a try." Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Zhang Qilon is an old general of the Mahist army. Be careful." "I understand." The city gate was opened and the soldiers of West Hill rushed out. A young man in a moon-white robe didn't have time to change into a battle robe. He directly jumped from the tower to the horse that rushed out of the city gate. He kicked the horse's abdomen and rushed toward the Mahist army. With Zhu Ling in the lead, the soldiers of West Hill rampaged through the Mahist army like a dragon. They were invincible. But they couldn't rush out of the black net of the Mahist army. Behind them, Zhang Qilon, who was riding on horseback and watching the battle, touched his chin and smiled. "This guy is a bit interesting." Behind him, his subordinate reminded him, "General, you are not his opponent." Zhang Qilon's face suddenly darkened. He was not a fool. Marching to war and fighting alone were two different things. Therefore, Zhang Qilon, who grew up in the military camp, naturally knew that there would always be someone stronger than him. It wasn't shameful that he couldn't defeat a kid who was younger than him, but it wasn't pleasant to hear his subordinate say it out loud. He glared at his subordinate angrily. "You talk too much." The subordinate helplessly rolled his eyes. "Wasn't it because the prince was afraid that you would rush forward in a moment of excitement that I reminded you? Who did I offend?" It was hard to be a subordinate these days. It was even harder to be a subordinate who thought for his superior. "General, what do you think? Do you want to take this guy down?" Zhang Qilon looked back at him. "Who's going?" The subordinate waved his hand and pointed to someone who was watching the battle next to him. Zhang Qilon looked at Qin Haodong's facial expression and immediately pulled a long face. "Commander Qin, Are you going to tell me where the princess went? You know, if anything happens to the princess, you and I will have to bear the consequences. Qin Feng looked at him sideways and smiled. General, don't worry. I have sent someone to pick up the princess. There will be no problem. Chapter 660. On the battlefield, Zhu Ling was invincible. The soldiers of the Mahist army could not sit still. Although Zhang Qilin knew that he was no match for Zhu Ling, he did not want to see Zhu Ling being so arrogant in front of him. Who is this guy? Zhang Qilin frowned and asked. Qin Feng smiled and said, he should be a descendant of Zhu Yan, probably a grandson. I heard that Zhu Yan had a grandson, but he was weak and sickly since he was 10 years old. No one has seen him since. Many people guessed that he died young. Now it seems that he is the one. Zhang Qilin nodded and said, no wonder. The grandson of General Jingtian is really something. Commander Qin, sorry to trouble you. Qi Lin's leader insisted on following him to defend the city. Wasn't this the purpose? Qin Feng gave a rare grin. With a pull of the reins, the well-trained warhorse whinnied and charged towards the man in moon-white clothes on the battlefield. In the fierce battle, Zhu Ling had already noticed that someone was rushing toward him. He waved away the enemy beside him and turned around to face the enemy, just in time to meet Qin Feng face to face. Qin Feng raised his eyebrows slightly and waved his long sword toward Zhu Ling's face. Zhu Ling dodged sideways on the horse and raised his long sword to fight back. The two of them fought back and forth on the horse. But they both used swords and the length of the long sword was limited. It was not convenient to fight on the horse. After dozens of rounds, the two of them jumped off the horse and landed on the battlefield. Zhu Ling shook the long sword in his hand and pointed it at Qin Feng's face. Who are you? Tell me your name. Qin Feng smiled and said, I am Qin Feng from the Prince Ding mansion. Who are you? Zhu Ling frowned slightly. His words were no different from not saying anything. But he still replied coldly, I am Zhu Ling, the commander of the Jingwa army in Weiling. Qin Feng smiled and said, so you are the descendant of General Zhu. Nice to meet you. Zhu Ling snorted. The two of them stopped talking and started fighting again. When Zhang Qilin saw that Zhu Ling was being held back by Qin Feng, he was instantly in a good mood. He nodded repeatedly and said, Wang Fei was right to see Qin Feng stay behind. Wang Fei is indeed far-sighted. This general is far inferior. If it weren't for Qin Feng, this Zhu Ling would not be easy to deal with. Therefore, the interference of these martial arts experts on the battlefield was the most annoying. If he ignored them, the lethality of these experts was several times or even dozens of times stronger than ordinary soldiers. If he sent out a general to fight with them, it would be a huge loss if he lost a general who could lead troops in battle because of a Jianghu expert. Zhang Qilin decided that in the future she would borrow a few Qi Lin from Wang Fei for every battle. Zhang Qilin was overjoyed. Zhu Yan on the city wall was not happy. As soon as Zhu Ling was held back, the formation of the West Hill soldiers behind him was immediately in chaos. The Mahist army took the opportunity to kill. In just a moment, more than half of the West Hill soldiers were lost. Qin Feng and Zhu Ling fought very happily. Although there were many martial arts experts in the Prince Ding mansion, they were all familiar with each other, so it was not interesting to fight. And Qin Feng did not have the courage to challenge a martial arts expert like Prince Ding for the time being. Therefore, it was rare to meet an unfamiliar martial arts expert like Zhu Ling. Naturally, he was in high spirits to fight with him. Zhu Ling, who was his opponent, was complaining in his heart. He did not expect that with his skills he would be held back by an unknown young general in the Mahist army for so long. Originally, he just wanted to kill Qin Feng as soon as possible to establish his authority. But now the fight was not over. He was already riding a tiger and could not get off. If Qin Feng did not stop, he would not be able to stop unilaterally. In this fight, he also found that Qin Feng's skills were not worse than his. If it went on like this, it was inevitable that both sides would be hurt. Then Qin Feng could afford to be hurt, but Zhu Ling could not afford to be hurt. He was the commander of the Jingwa army, and his grandfather Zhu Yan was old and could not lead the army to charge and break through the enemy lines. As a result, Zhu Ling was more impatient and less calm. Qin Feng seized the opportunity to launch a series of fierce attacks. He was flustered and was almost seriously injured. On the city wall, Zhu Yan frowned as he watched Zhu Ling fighting with Qin Feng. He signaled the soldiers around him to retreat. As soon as the horn sounded, the West Hill soldiers quickly retreated into the city gate. Zhang Qilan did not let people chase after them. The city gate of this small city was easy to open, but the nearly 200,000 Xiling army in the city gate was not so easy to deal with. If they fought with the Xiling army after entering the city, the Mahist army would not be willing to accept too many casualties. Qin Feng did not want to continue fighting. He generously retreated a distance and let Zhu Ling go back to the city. Then he mounted his horse and returned to the Mahist army. How was it? Zhang Qilan asked. Qin Feng's face was full of satisfaction. He nodded and praised, Master General Zhang, you'd better not rashly confront him. Zhang Qilan curled his lips and muttered discontentedly, I know, I'm not tired of living. You boy, can you tell me now? Where did the princess go? Don't think that Zhang Qilan was careless because he was careless. It was said that the princess who came to support them did not show up from beginning to end. How could Zhang Qilan not be anxious? Looking at the situation, even Wang Yi did not know where Wang Fei had run off to. If His Highness knew about this, wouldn't he skin him alive? General Zhang, calm down. Qin Feng comforted him. Didn't I say that I have sent people to pick up the princess? Zhang Qilan rolled his eyes at him angrily. You might as well not say it. It was to the point that she needed people to pick her up. Obviously, the place where the princess went was not so safe. Taking a deep breath, Zhang Qilan suppressed the impulse to throw this man out. What can we do? Qin Feng thought for a while and said, wait for the princess's signal, and then encircle and destroy the enemy with Feng San? Isn't Feng San in the camp? Where did he come from? Zhang Qilan roared. Qin Feng looked calm. Heaven's secret can't be revealed. General, do you understand? I don't understand. Less than a quarter of an hour after the two armies retreated, thick smoke suddenly rose from the mountains in the southwest. It was a good day with no clouds in the sky. The fog that usually lingered in the mountains also dissipated a lot. Even if they were dozens of miles away, they could see it clearly. Seeing this, Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan were shocked. Grandfather. In the mountains, there were not only hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers hidden in the mountains, but also enough food for 200,000 soldiers to eat for a year. Zhu Yan naturally knew this. His old face looked gloomy. Take the soldiers back. But grandfather here, Zhu Ling said anxiously. Zhu Yan interrupted him. Don't say more. If the camp is taken by the Mahist army, we will be trapped in the city. The food can't support us for a few days. This small city was not a big city like Bian City. Even if the Mahist army did not attack, the Mahist army could encircle the city for 3 to 5 months. With an army of over 100,000 soldiers, it would only take 3 to 5 days for them to finish off all the food in this small city. At that time, they could only wait for the Mahist army to come and clean them up with hunger. The Mahist army won't have so many people. There are definitely no more than 30,000 people over there. Take the soldiers back. No matter what, you must stabilize there. Zhu Yan ordered. Chapter 661. Grandfather. Zhu Yan sighed and patted his grandson on the shoulder. Go ahead. I'll cover you. Zhu Ling gritted his teeth and nodded with red eyes. I know. Take care, grandfather. Go ahead. Zhu Ling led the hundreds of thousands of soldiers and horses he brought to the mountains where they had been entrenched for more than 10 years. In the small town behind him, Zhu Yan, who was over 70 years old, led less than 50,000 West Hill soldiers to guard this lonely small town. What they had to face was the murderous aura of over 100,000 strong Mo family troops behind them. Riding on the horse, Zhu Ling looked back at the small town in the night. He only heard his grandfather's old voice standing alone on the tower and looking in his direction. Zhu Ling's heart trembled. He endured the piercing pain in his eyes, whipped the horse beneath him and quickly galloped forward. The small town was not far from the mountains where the Jingwa army was stationed. 20 to 30 miles was just a matter of 2 hours for the army. But after entering the mountains, they had to slow down. Even though this was a place that they could not be more familiar with after living here for more than 10 years. Now the people hiding here were no longer their comrades and relatives, but their enemies hiding in the dark. Young master, the scout ahead reported that there was no movement ahead. The guard rode back to Zhu Ling and reported in a low voice. Zhu Ling said in a low voice, it's more problematic that there is no movement. I'm afraid the people left behind are all gone. Before he left 30,000 soldiers in the mountains. If they came back, how could there be no movement at all? Now, looking at the dark and silent mountains in front of him, Zhu Ling wiped away the last bit of hope in his heart. Young master, that Miss Yang is really... The guard could not continue. Although they had only known each other for a few days, he had a good impression of Miss Yang. At the same time, he could see that his young master treated the girl differently. They lived in the mountains all year round and rarely had contact with outsiders. If the young master and Miss Yang could be together, it would be a good thing. But he did not expect. Thinking of the weak and gentle girl, Zhu Ling's face darkened. He never thought that he would be deceived by a woman, and that woman. Even now, he still had a trace of hope that this was just a misunderstanding. However, his rationality also told him that there was no such thing as a coincidence in this world. Looking at his young master's gloomy face in the dark night, the guard quickly changed the topic and said, "Young master, after passing this call, we will reach our camp. Tell the people in front to be careful." Zhu Ling nodded and said in a deep voice, "But sometimes it was useless to be careful." The path in the mountains was narrow, and the soldiers in front of them passed through safely without any incident. Just as everyone was about to relax, a loud sound rang out from the mountains. People were shocked to see a huge rock being pushed down from the top of the mountain by something. Then there was a rumbling sound all around, and countless rocks rolled down from the sides of the hill. Soon the path forward and backward was blocked. Needless to say, the wails and cries for help from the countless soldiers who were smashed by the rocks instantly resounded throughout the entire forest. Soon, countless torches were lit on both sides of the mountain. In an instant, they lit up the dark forest like two dazzling dragons. Some of the West Hill soldiers trapped in the valley cried out in panic, and some had already counterattacked. But the other side was on high ground, and the Mahist army's archery was famous in all countries. For a moment, the valley was filled with the thick smell of blood. Zhu Ling stood silently in the midst of the chaos. The bodyguards around him loyally deflected the arrows that were shot at him. His handsome face was filled with malice and anger in the flickering light of the fire, but he was powerless in the face of the rain of arrows pouring down from above. More than a decade of hard work, more than 20 years of his grandfather's painstaking efforts, had it been destroyed before he could even react? Today, it was not only the hundreds of thousands of the Zhu family's Jingguo army that were destroyed in this small valley. It was also his more than a decade of painstaking effort, more than a decade of patience and ambition. In the end, he was still too young. What Zhu Ling did not understand was that heroes were born in troubled times. However, there were only a few heroes in a chaotic world. Most of them were cannon fodders who were buried with the heroes. And in this world, there was no rule that whoever sacrificed enough would become a hero in troubled times. "Young master, leave quickly." The guard behind him pushed him, bringing him back to his senses. Only then did Zhu Ling see that the guards around him were already wounded, but they still surrounded him and bitterly held on. But the terrain was already extremely unfavorable to them, and the Mahist army's archers were not so easy to resist. At this time they were already at the end of the road. Zhu Ling smiled bitterly. "Leave? Where can I go? Anywhere is good. Where there is life, there is hope. Young master, leave quickly." The guard hurriedly called out and could not help but push Zhu Ling again, reminding him sternly, "Young master, don't forget that the old general is still waiting for you." Zhu Ling was startled, as if he had really come back to his senses. Looking up, the valley was a scene of devastation, and less than 20% of the soldiers could stand up. "Protect young master. Kill our way out," the person beside him roared. Soon the loyal guards and retainers of the Zhu family all rushed over, supporting Zhu Ling as he rushed forward. They had lived in this forest for more than 20 years, and naturally understood where they had the best chance of escaping. The remaining soldiers seemed to understand that they were in a desperate situation, and they all roared as they rushed up the hills on both sides, wanting to perish together with the enemy. However, even more of them were shot down again. Occasionally there were a few who climbed to the top, but they could not escape the sharp blades of the Mahist army that were already waiting there. The group of people protecting Zhu Ling were all experts in martial arts, but in the end, only 7 or 8 of them managed to escape the valley. Once they got out of the encirclement and entered the forest, it would be their world. No matter how strong the Mahist army was, it would be extremely difficult to find them in this kind of mountain range. But once they rushed out of the valley, the scene in front of them still shocked them. Even in the darkness of the night, They could still see the tragic scene of corpses strewn across the field through the dim moonlight, and the thick smell of blood in the air. These were the soldiers who had rushed out first. Unfortunately, they did not die in the barrage of arrows in the valley, but they were still unable to escape the enemy's ambush outside. "Young master, let's go." A guard riddled with wounds pulled Zhu Ling aside and said hoarsely. "Let's go," Zhu Ling said hoarsely. "Young master Zhu." An elegant and graceful voice drifted through the bloody forest. Zhu Ling's heart trembled and he raised his head to look. Not far from the mountain path, a white-clothed girl stood in the wind. Under the dim moonlight, the girl's face revealed a crystalline luster, and her graceful and elegant eyes held a faint luster. She suddenly appeared in this dark and bloody mountain battlefield, making people feel like she was a banshee of the forest. Chapter 662. Who are you? Zhu Ling's voice was dry and pale as he stared at the young girl in front of him and asked with difficulty. The white-clothed young girl smiled faintly at him and said apologetically, "I am Yi Li, Yi Li." Such an ordinary word, such an ordinary name. But in Zhu Ling's ears, these two words were like a thunderclap from the ninth heaven, deafening. A beat later, Zhu Ling slowly laughed. "Yi Li, Yi Li. Appointed king's consort Yi Li." As though he had heard something funny, Zhu Ling's laughter grew louder and louder until he couldn't breathe. "You are Princess Ding." Yi Li nodded and said, "I am Princess Ding." "You lied to me." Zhu Ling gritted his teeth. Yi Li nodded. "I lied to you." There was some regret and helplessness in her clear eyes, but there was no regret or guilt. When two armies fought, there was no good or evil, no right or wrong. There were only positions. If they had different positions, then they were enemies. Against enemies. No matter the means, this was the principle that Yi Li recognized in her previous life. "Princess Ding." Zhu Ling murmured in a low voice. "I heard that in the past the army of Enchanting of Genom, king of Gojoseon, was almost completely wiped out by Princess Ding. Today Zhu Ling lost to Princess Ding again, but it wasn't a loss. To have Wang Fei go through so much trouble, it is the fortune of 3 lifetimes." Yi Li said with a helpless smile, "Zhu Gongzi's army of 100,000 is not a lot, but our army is lacking soldiers right now. If Gongzi suddenly appeared, it would cause a lot of trouble for the Mahist army. In desperate times we can only use desperate measures. If I have been rude, please forgive me." "You have targeted the Jing Guojun from the start?" Zhu Ling asked. Yi Li smiled faintly and did not deny it. "Old General Zhu has silently hidden more than 100,000 soldiers and horses near Bian City. Presumably he also has a lot of provisions. To tell you the truth, the first thing we are interested in is not young Master Zhu's army, but the provisions to feed them." Not far away, Feng Jiao strolled over in a bright red brocade robe. The long sword in his hand was still dripping with blood. Yi Li smiled helplessly. She looked at Feng Jiao and asked, "Why are you here?" Feng Jiao said with a smile, "Wang Fei is personally in danger. If I don't come, how can I explain to the prince?" Yi Li frowned and looked at Feng Jiao indifferently. "You don't have to tell him." Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows. Did Wang Fei think that it was possible to hide it? Seeing the exchange of glances between the two, Zhu Ling's expression dimmed. He sighed softly and looked calmly at the young woman in white. "What does Wang Fei want?" Yi Li was silent for a moment and then said faintly, "Young master, please come back with us." Zhu Ling was silent. A moment later he raised his head and laughed. Pointing at Yi Li, he said loudly, "I, Zhu Ling, have accomplished nothing in my life. But as a member of the Zhu family, I will not be a prisoner. I will not give you the chance to threaten my grandfather." Yi Li sighed regretfully and said, "Then what does young master want?" Zhu Ling took the long sword of the guard next to him and pointed at the black cloud cavalry behind Feng Jiao. He said in a low voice, "I ask for death in battle." The smile on Feng Jiao's face slowly faded and was replaced by a serious expression. In his view, Zhu Ling was still immature. In a few more years his achievements would be above his own. As a general, even if the other was a defeated general, he admired and was willing to fulfill his wish. He casually cut a piece of cloth and wiped the blood off the sword. Feng Jiao nodded and said, "Young Master Zhu, pleased?" "Wait." Yi Li's voice came from the side. Feng Jiao raised an eyebrow and put away his long sword to look at Yi Li. Yi Li raised her hand to stop Lin Han behind her. She slowly walked forward and looked at the youth whose clothes were stained with blood. She said softly and clearly, "This consort is willing to fight with young master Wang Fei." Feng Jiao and the others were shocked and wanted to stop her. Even though Zhu Ling's army had been defeated, Zhu Ling himself was still an expert. The bloodstains on his body weren't his. In fact, Zhu Ling hadn't really done anything tonight. Yi Li waved her hand to stop Feng Jiao and the others from trying to persuade her. She slowly walked in front of Zhu Ling. "This consort is willing to fight with young master. Is this possible? I have heard that Wang Fei is also an expert. This one is fortunate. Please." In the not-so-vast forest, corpses were strewn everywhere and blood flowed like a river. On the battlefield littered with the corpses of Xiling soldiers, a man in white and a woman in white stood facing each other calmly. If not for the corpses and blood-stained swords, this would have been a beautiful scene. Not far away there was a crowd silently watching them. The long sword in Zhu Ling's hand trembled and drew out 2 silver sword flowers. Yi Li smiled faintly at him. A snow-white dagger flashed at her fingertips. It seemed to only pause for a moment. The 2 figures charged at each other at great speed. For a moment the 2 figures intersected and then tangled together. Zhu Ling's sword was filled with sword energy. Yi Li's dagger also flashed with a dark and cold aura. Zhu Ling quickly found that he could not gain any advantage against this woman in close combat. It even greatly restricted his swordsmanship. So he quickly pulled away from Yi Li. However, how could Yi Li give him the chance to do so? Her cold dagger was like a maggot that stuck to his bones as it brushed past his clothes again and again. The skin under his clothes was also stirred up by a layer of chill. The long sword and short dagger collided. Yi Li's hand holding the dagger trembled slightly. After all, it was difficult for a woman to compete against a man in strength. Frowning, the dagger moved along the blade and sliced at Zhu Ling's wrist. Zhu Ling lowered his wrist and hurriedly dodged. "Princess Ding is very skilled. Young Master Zhu praises me too much." Outside the battlefield, Feng Jiao frowned as he stared at the 2 fighting. But he had to admit that Wang Fei had improved quickly in the past few years. Even against a rare expert like Zhu Ling, she was not at a disadvantage. Lin Han had come to his side at some point. He was also staring at the 2 fighting. He asked, "Young Master Feng-san, why are you here?" "Zheng." Feng Jiao said, "Qin Feng is enough there. Even if he is not enough, he can stall for time until we get back. I am worried about Wang Fei going into danger alone. But are your wounds okay?" Lin Han rubbed his back and shook his head. That wound looked fierce and dangerous, but the person who had done it had calculated and avoided a vital spot. It could only count as a flesh wound. Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows and smiled. "I think it should be fine. This young master did it personally. This young master calculated well, didn't he? Many thanks to young Master Feng-san for showing mercy." Lin Han gritted his teeth. Even though he had done it willingly, no one would be in a good mood after being cut for no reason. What's more, the culprit was still there proudly taking credit for it. Lin Han deeply felt that this young Master Feng-san should be taught a lesson. Chapter 663. Wang Fei, be careful. Feng Jiao, who had been laughing merrily, saw the silver light flash and hurriedly warned in a stern voice. On the other side, one of Zhu Ling's subordinates looked at Yi Li, who was evenly matched with Zhu Ling, and a vicious light flashed through his eyes. The moment Yi Li and Zhu Ling separated, a hidden weapon flashing with silver light shot out. Hearing Feng Jiao's warning, Yi Li also heard the sound of a hidden weapon breaking through the air behind her. Without turning her head, she swung the dagger in her hand backwards to block the hidden weapon behind her. But Zhu Ling, who was not far away, suddenly leapt at her. Yi Li frowned slightly. Just as she was about to send out a palm strike, she saw Zhu Ling push her aside. The hidden weapon shot into Zhu Ling's chest without any obstruction. "Young master!" The guard shouted harshly. Before they could react, the long arrows of the Mahist army had penetrated their chests. Yi Li steadied herself and turned to look at the person on the ground. A hint of shock flashed across her beautiful face. Feng Jiao saw that Wang Fei was fine and released a breath. He hurriedly led people forward to see if there was anyone alive in that group to prevent another hidden weapon like the one just now. That hidden weapon was a common willow leaf dart. The entire dart had shot into Zhu Ling's chest and only the head of the dart glowing with a blue light was exposed. Feng Jiao's expression changed slightly. He said, "There's poison on the dart." Lin Han looked at Zhu Ling on the ground and said faintly, even if he did not block it, the dart would not have hit Wang Fei. Originally, Yi Li's dagger could have knocked the dart away, but it had been knocked aside by Zhu Ling. Zhu Ling was lying on the ground covered in blood. His upper body was pillowed on the body of a soldier who had been dead for a long time. His eyes were dim as he looked at Yi Li in front of him. His lips moved but he did not say anything in the end. Yi Li lowered her head to look at him and said indifferently, "Why do you have to do this?" The handsome young man forced a smile on his lips and said, "I've lost. My life is actually like this." Yi Li said calmly, "Victory and defeat are common in war. You can only flip your cards if you're alive. If you're dead you'll have nothing." Zhu Ling was stunned for a moment before he quickly shook his head and smiled at her. "What's the point of saying all this now? I never thought that I would be defeated like this. Just like how I never thought that you would actually be the chosen imperial concubine." Yi Li was silent. Zhu Ling smiled faintly and said, "You don't have to feel sorry. I'm also tired. The poison on the willow leaf dart was obviously not an ordinary poison. After a while, black blood flowed out from the corner of Zhu Ling's mouth and he slowly closed his eyes. Yi Li looked at the scene of corpses lying in front of her. She looked at the young man whose moon-white clothes were already stained with blood. She closed her eyes peacefully. Suddenly she felt a bone-chilling cold and couldn't help but wrap her arms around herself. "Princess, he didn't want to live. It's not your fault," Lin Han whispered. Even if Zhu Ling didn't block the dart, Princess would be fine. They could see it clearly from so far away, so could Zhu Ling, who was next to them. From the moment he pulled out his sword and asked for the battle, he already had the will to die. Such a proud young man had tasted such a crushing defeat in the first battle of his life. He had no reason to let himself live. "I know." Yi Li nodded and said, "Clean up the battlefield and go back to reinforce General Zhang." "Yes, Princess," Feng Zhiyao replied. In a small town dozens of miles away, Zhu Yan, who couldn't sleep late at night, stood on the city wall and looked into the distance. Suddenly, an inexplicable tremor made him stunned. He stared blankly at the southwest direction and moved his lips. 2 lines of turbid tears slowly flowed down his wrinkled face. Ling'e, the West Hill defenders in the small town suddenly launched an attack in the 4th night watch period. Although the Mahist army had been vigilant, the 4th night watch period was the time when most soldiers were sleeping. The sudden attack caused the Mo family army to be in a state of chaos. But after all, the Mahist army was an elite army. Soon they reacted and fought with Zhu Yan's Shilling army. "What's going on? Why did Zhu Yan suddenly attack?" Behind the army, Zhang Qilan stared at the battlefield in front of him and asked in a deep voice. He had been in the army for half of his life, so it was easy for him to see that the morale of the West Hill defenders in front of him was completely different from before. It was clear that they wanted to die together with the Mahist army. Looking up at the old figure standing on the city wall in the distance, Zhang Qilan always felt that something had happened that he didn't know. With Zhu Yan's experience and ability in war, it was absolutely impossible for him to make such a decision. On the other hand, Qin Feng, who was at the side, had a calm expression. He said indifferently, "It's probably because Princess Consort and the others succeeded. But we haven't received the news yet." "How did Zhu Yan get the news?" "Succeeded?" Zhang Qilan turned around and grabbed Qin Feng's collar and said, "You haven't told me, where did Princess go?" Qin Feng slowly slapped away the hand that was grabbing his collar and said, "Wang Fei has gone to investigate where Zhu Ling's army of 100,000 is staying. And there should be a large number of provisions there. In this way we don't have to worry about provisions and military supplies in a short time." "What?" Zhang Qilan was shocked. "Princess went." Qin Feng laughed and said, "Otherwise, why do you think we are guarding this useless county these days? If they hide in the mountains and refuse to come out, even if we send in 300 or 400,000 troops, we may not be able to do anything to them. Now they come out by themselves, right? As soon as they come out, we can take the opportunity to destroy that place. The 100,000 troops that went back last night are probably gone. Otherwise Zhu Yan wouldn't be so crazy." Zhang Qilan took a few deep breaths. He felt that he was almost scared to death by the sudden news. But this was good news, wasn't it? Even if Zhu Yan was crazy, he was not afraid of him in this dark fight. The difference in strength between the two sides was not much. It was hard to say who would win in the end. In the chaotic battle between the two armies, the sound of horse hooves came from afar. The Mahist army soldiers who were familiar with them all showed joy. It's the Black Cloud Cavalry. The Black Cloud Cavalry is coming. In the southwest, a black cavalry swept over like a gust of wind. They rushed into the battlefield quickly. Soon the battle that was originally evenly matched became one-sided. Behind the black cavalry, Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao rode horses one after the other and quickly merged into the camp of the Mahist army. Seeing Yi Li coming back from afar, Zhang Qilan quickly led people to greet her. Princess. Yi Li glanced at the battlefield in front of her and of course saw the lonely old figure on the tower. She paused for a moment and said, General Zhang, you don't have to be so polite. How is the battle? Zhang Qilan smiled and said, Princess, don't worry. With the Black Cloud Cavalry joining in, the defenders of Xiling will be wiped out before dawn. Seeing Yi Li come back with his own eyes, Zhang Qilan was completely relieved. A few days ago the princess came with Qin Feng and others, saying that they were under the order of the prince to help him defend the city. But ever since the princess consort came he had never seen her again. It was not until just now that he knew what the princess saw. It only scared him so much that his heart was still trembling. If something happened to the princess, how could they explain it to the prince? Chapter 664. Congratulations, Your Highness. You have wiped out hundreds of thousands of Jingguo army without any effort. Zhang Qilan smiled. Yi Li smiled faintly and shook her head. If it weren't for the general, it wouldn't be so easy. The killing continued until the sky was dark. The West Hill defenders finally could not resist and gradually retreated into the city. The city gates and walls of the small city were unable to provide any form of defense. The Mo family army and the Black Cloud Cavalry only used less than 2 hours to knock open the city gates and once again charge into the small city. In fact, there were not many West Hill defenders in the small city. Only intermittent fighting sounds came from some streets and alleys from time to time. Yi Li and the others stepped into the city. The soldiers who entered the city first came to report, General Zhu Yan is still on the tower. Everyone looked at each other. Yi Li whispered, let's go and see. The others naturally had no objection. They followed Yi Li and stepped on the tower of the small city. In the corner of the tower, Zhu Yan was wearing an old battle robe. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked in the direction of Bian City in the distance. Even Yi Li and the others did not seem to hear it. Yi Li was not in a hurry. She just calmly looked at the back of the old man. After a long time, Zhu Yan slowly turned around and looked at everyone. Finally, his eyes fell on Yi Li, who was in white, and reached out his hand. He asked in a deep voice, This is Miss Yang? Yi Li cupped her hands and said respectfully with a faint smile, Junior Yi Li greets General Zhu. Zhu Yan nodded and smiled. Is she really the princess? He's so young. She is really a young talent. The Prince Ding mansion is blessed. Yi Li whispered, Senior, you flatter me. Zhu Yan looked at her with a trace of indescribable strangeness in his eyes. After hesitating for a moment he asked, My useless grandson, how did you deal with him? Yi Li sighed slightly and whispered, Master Zhu has died in the battle. I'm sorry for your loss. Zhu Yan's body trembled slightly. His hand holding the spear could not help but shake. In the end he could only look up at the sky and let out a long sigh. He said, So he died in battle. It's my fault. Originally he could have. His only grandson had been very intelligent and talented since he was young. If it wasn't for him, he could have lived a free life with fame and fortune. Because of him, because of his wishes and ambitions, Zhu Ling had hidden himself deep in the mountains at the age of 12 or 13, refusing to see outsiders. Even if he died on the battlefield, no one would ever know his name and he would never receive the status and glory that he deserved. Of Zhu Yan's his mansion, of sorry for of his death. Master Zhu Yan's Zhu Yan of his. Zhu Yan shook his head and said, Princess Ding, you don't have to persuade me. I'm almost 70 years old. I've lived long enough. Since I've lost today, I have nothing to say. Feng Jiao frowned slightly and said loudly, Why do you say that, General Zhu? The Mahist army is not a ruthless person. Zhu Yan looked at Feng Jiao and could not help but laugh. He laughed and said, Do you mean that the Mahist army still wants to persuade me to surrender? I'm of no use to the Mahist army. I've fought for the West Hill for half of my life. In the end I've lost my integrity. It's ridiculous. Yili looked down and said lightly, General, you misunderstood me. You are of noble character and unquestionable integrity. The Mahist army dare not persuade you to surrender. Now that victory and defeat have been decided between us, the old general has long since retired. Please leave now. The Prince Ding mansion will not make things difficult for you. Zhu Yan looked at Yili and asked, Aren't you afraid that I'll come back and fight against the Mahist army after I leave? Yili shook her head and said, I believe in you, General. After a long silence on the gate tower, Zhu Yan finally laughed loudly and shook his head. He said, Thank you for your kindness, Princess. It's a pity. Zhu Yan was Jingtian General of the West Hill in life and death. Today Zhu Yan is defeated. He has no face to see the elders and the late Emperor of the West Hill. I'd rather die. Old General, Zhu Ling calmly looked at the woman in white in front of him, with a touch of regret and helplessness in his eyes. It's a pity. How could he not know that his grandson was brought up by him? When Ling Er mentioned the woman named Yang Xinya to him, he knew that the woman was a little different in his eyes. Now he finally saw a woman who could make his grandson look at her differently. But it was a pity. Fate made fools of people. Old General Zhu? Under everyone's shocked gazes, the old man, who was already 70 years old, suddenly leaped up and fell off the city wall. Yili stepped forward. Her sleeves moved slightly, but she stopped in the end. The crowd went forward and stood on the gate to look down. At the gate of the city, the old man lay quietly. Blood slowly flowed out from under him, dyeing the ground under him and the white hair on his head red. Yili silently looked at the old man who had lost his life under the city wall. Her eyes were sad. Princess? Feng Jiao asked worriedly. Yili calmly turned around and said, Restrain yourself. Give him a proper burial. Yes. Chapter 665. Bian City. The Mahist army outside Bian City and the Xiling army stationed in Bian City carried out a routine confrontation every day. The leaders of the Mahist army were a group of young men under the age of 30. No matter how hard they tried, it was difficult for them to cause any impact to Long Yang's defense. But in this kind of non-stop attack every day, Long Yang gradually sensed a conspiracy. But he could not understand what the Mahist army wanted to do. Old General, the Mahist army is outside the city again. Lei Tingfeng strode in and looked at Long Yang, who was sitting behind the desk in deep thought. Although there was no clear victor between the Mahist army these days, Lei Tingfeng was still satisfied with the current situation. He was not a radical person, and now he did not hope to be able to defeat the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. As long as he could delay until his father and the reinforcements arrived, he would have won. Long Yang frowned and said, Ignore them for now. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, I'm afraid not. This time it seems to be different from before. Long Yang stood up and said, I'll go take a look. When he went up the tower and looked down, it was indeed different from the previous few days. Although he still did not see Mo Xiuyao and the other main generals, the Mahist army's aura and formation were unprecedentedly strong compared to a few days ago. The one standing in front of the formation was still Yun Ting. These days Yun Ting and the group of young generals had been hit hard enough. No matter how much effort they put into arranging the troops, attacking openly and sneakily, Long Yang could easily resolve it. If it was not a serious time for the two armies to face off, they would almost think that Long Yang was playing with them. After being hit hard, these young people also gradually restrained their arrogance. Every time they faced off, they became more careful. They did not expect to be able to break through Bian City, but it was enough to delay Long Yang's line of sight and occasionally create some trouble for him. After calming down, the young generals also understood that the prince and Wang Fei would not really let those old generals play and leave the Mahist army to these young people who did not know anything. Such an arrangement must mean that the prince and Wang Fei had some secret plans. The prince did not expect them to be able to take Bian City, so they had to cooperate with the prince and Wang Fei's plan. Sure enough, a few days later, they received another order from the prince. At the same time, they also understood what those capable seniors in the army were doing. Long Yang, what kind of ability is it to hide in the city? Come out and fight me if you have the guts. Yun Ting shouted. Long Yang looked down at the young man and said with a smile, Young man, if you have the ability, come up and talk to me. Phasesus Yun Ting sneered, So be it. Do you think this general is afraid of you? General Long, do you want to know how your General Zhu is? Long Yang's heart was cold. He squinted and said, What do you want to say? Yun Ting laughed. Zhu Yan is dead and the hundreds of thousands of Jingguo army hidden in the mountains have been wiped out. Do you think that if you hide in the city every day our prince can't do anything about it? Or do you really think that there is no one in the Mahist army? We are just here to play with you. When the prince has dealt with Zhu Yan and the Jingguo army, he will naturally come back to meet you, General Feng Tian. Zhu Yan was dead. Hearing this, not only Long Yang and Lei Tingfeng were shocked, but also the generals of the West Hill army guarding the city were shocked. Although the reputation of the three famous generals of West Hill had been suppressed by Genom of Gojoseon for more than 20 years, the generals and soldiers naturally knew about them. Bian City had been besieged for only a few days and hundreds of thousands of Jingguo army had been wiped out. Even General Jingtian had died in battle. How could the generals and soldiers of West Hill not be shocked? After all, Long Yang was a veteran of the battlefield. He suppressed the shock in his heart and sneered, You're exaggerating. Come up and let me have a look. Yun Ting was not as angry as a few days ago when he was provoked by Long Yang. He smiled and waved the war flag in his hand. Behind the Mahist army camp, the war drums suddenly sounded, and the soldiers of the Mahist army also followed the movement of the flags and moved into battle formation. It was obvious that they were ready to attack the city. Long Yang only took a glance and understood why Lei Tingfeng said that today was different from a few days ago. Such a huge battle formation was definitely not something that these young generals in front of him could set up. This also showed that the Mahist army had no patience to confront them. At the same time, Long Yang understood that what the young general of the Mahist army said was probably not false. The hidden hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers in Zhu Yan were all gone. Sighing helplessly, Long Yang ordered his men to stay in the city. Old General, is old General Zhu? Lei Tingfeng asked worriedly. Long Yang said lightly, It bodes ill rather than well. Then we? Lei Tingfeng asked. Long Yang looked at him and shook his head, We can't go out of the city to fight anymore. Defend and wait for reinforcements. Yes. Lei Tingfeng said quietly. Under the city tower, Yun Ting looked at the West Hill soldiers who were guarding the city gate and refused to come out to fight. He could not help but stomp his feet. Qin Yun helplessly tugged at Yun Ting's sleeve and said, As your highness expected, the enemy won't come out and fight us in close quarters. Yun Ting angrily said, I don't believe that he can hide in the city forever. Killing God of the Western region? He's more like a coward. Qin Yun smiled and said, He doesn't have to hide in the city for a lifetime. As long as he can defend for a month or two when the West Hill reinforcements arrive, we will be in trouble. Yun Ting said impatiently, I don't believe that there is no way to get him out of the city. Fight for me. There was a moat in front of Bian City. The river was quite wide. If they wanted to cross the river, they would have to lower the drawbridge or find a way on their own. In the past few days, the young generals did not completely waste their time arguing with the other side. They had ordered the craftsmen in the Mahist army to build more than a dozen long ladders. Once they were placed on the surface of the river, they could cross the river by laying down wooden planks. Qin Yun looked at the soldiers in front of him braving the enemy's arrow rain to set up the bridge planks. Many of them had already died in the chaotic arrows. He could not help but grit his teeth. For a city like Bian City that was easy to defend and hard to attack, it was impossible to break through without paying a certain amount of casualties. Even if they braved the arrow rain, they still managed to set up the bridge. The archery skills of the Mahist army soldiers were not just for show. Even from the bottom to the top, many West Hill soldiers fell off the city wall. Most of the Mahist army crossed the moat. Some people climbed up the ladders to the top of the city wall. Some people shot arrows from the bottom to the top of the city wall. The water in the moat behind them gradually turned red. Behind the Mahist army, Mo Shuyao appeared on the battlefield with a group of people. They did not participate in the battle. Instead, they stood in the distance and watched quietly. After a long time, they heard Mo Shuyao laugh and say, Yun Ting and the others look pretty good. They had lost more than they won, but they could still hold on. They could even raise the morale of the Mahist army. For these young generals who had not really been on the battlefield, it was already pretty good. Chapter 666. Beside him, Zhuojing smiled and said, Don't the prince and consort trust them? Mo Shuyao nodded and looked up at the city wall in the distance. he said in a low voice, "Get ready to attack." Yes. Dark clouds covered thousands of miles in the clear sky. A low and hoarse voice sounded in the air, and soon beautiful fireworks bloomed in the air. Some of the West Hill soldiers guarding the city were shocked to find that there were ropes hanging in the air in several directions outside the city. Then black figures moved along the ropes and quickly moved towards the city. Long Yong could naturally see this situation. His eyes narrowed and he said sternly, "Shoot." Countless arrows flew towards the people sliding on the ropes. But even faster, a group of men in black appeared in the city and mercilessly shot their bows at the soldiers guarding the city. What's going on? How did these people appear? Black figures wearing Mahist army uniforms kept appearing in the city. These people were different from the usual Mahist army. They were obviously stronger than the Mahist army soldiers. They were a group of a few dozen people, and everywhere they went the West Hill defenders suffered heavy losses. At the same time, they had to take care of the Mahist army outside the city, which was attacking with all their might. For a moment the West Hill defenders were in a mess. On the city wall, Long Yong and Lei Tingfeng's faces were ashen. "Old General," Long Yong gritted his teeth and said, "Capture everyone in the city from Dechu State and the northwest and bring them up to the city tower." "Old General." Lei Tingfeng's face changed when he heard this. Of course he knew what Long Yong wanted to do. In fact, there were many who did this when two countries were at war. However, Lei Tingfeng was doubtful about how effective this would be. Gritting his teeth, Lei Tingfeng turned and left. Although there were many Mahist army in the city, there were still hundreds of thousands of West Hill defenders in Bien City. It was difficult for the small Mahist army to affect the overall situation. In less than an hour, the West Hill soldiers had captured the people of Dechu State in Bien City and brought them to the top of the city wall. Bien City was the second largest city in West Hill, and its prosperity was no less than that of the Emperor of Xiling. There were many people from different countries living here. Most of them were citizens of Dechu State, and a large portion of them were citizens of the Northwest Mahist Army. These people were taken to the top of the city wall and placed on top of the battlements of Bien City. If the Mahist army below wanted to come up, they would have to get past them first. If they wanted to shoot, they would have to kill them first. Most of these people were ordinary people, and the sudden experience of war was enough to make them tremble with fear. Now they were even brought to the top of the city wall to block the Mahist army's arrows. Many of them were so scared that they started to cry. "Long Yong, you shameless old man." Seeing this, Yun Ting finally couldn't help but curse again. Beside him, Qin Yun and the others also had ugly expressions. Not to mention that these people were citizens of Dechu State and the Northwest. Even if they were citizens of West Hill, using ordinary people to block arrows was a shameful thing for a general. "What do we do now?" "How would I know?" "Go and report to the prince," Qin Yun said. After all, they weren't cold-hearted. On the battlefield, it was their duty to fight to the death between two armies. But it was difficult for them to make the decision to shoot these ordinary people who had no power to resist. In fact, there was no need for them to report. Emo Shuyao, who had been behind the Mahist army all this time, naturally saw the situation. Standing beside him, Zhuijing frowned and said, "Prince, what should we do?" They really hadn't expected Long Yong to do this. But when Long Yong was young, he had been called the killing god of the Western region. In the past, he had killed many ordinary people in the Western region. His actions were unexpected but also reasonable. Emo Shuyao stood up and stared calmly at the top of the city wall in the distance. "He wants to delay us first and clear out the Qilin in the city." Bien City's defenses were very good. They had spent so many days, but the Mahist army that could enter Bien City was less than 1,000 people. If they were faced with hundreds of thousands of West Hill defenders, they had no chance of winning. Long Yong didn't want to be attacked from the front and the back. He had to clear out the enemy who had entered the city and figure out how they had entered. And all of this needed time. Let's go and take a look. Because of the people on the city wall, the Mahist army's attack on the city temporarily stopped. But the soldiers on both sides didn't let down their guard. The Mahist army's black camp suddenly parted to form a path. A white-haired man in white walked out of the army, followed by a few guards and generals. Emo Shuyao raised his hand and glanced at the people on the city wall who had been pushed out. He said in a low voice, "West Hill General Feng, I've heard a lot about you." Long Yong appeared on the city wall and looked at the white-haired man in the distance. He nodded and said, "Prince Ding Emo Shuyao? Nice to meet you." When these words were said, the people on the city wall who were sobbing and crying were all stunned. They looked at the white-haired man below the city wall. Some people even became excited and shouted for help. Prince Ding is here. Prince Ding is here. Your Highness, please save us. Someone shouted, and very quickly more people started crying and shouting. Suddenly, there was a wave of crying on the city wall. What do you want, General Fengben? Emo Shuyao asked calmly. His voice wasn't loud and didn't even have the slightest hint of anger. But strangely, it spread throughout the entire battlefield amidst the crying. Long Yong looked at him deeply and said, "As a general, I am deeply ashamed to use such a method. But, Prince, please give the order to retreat for 30 li." Emo Shuyao asked. What if I don't agree? Long Yong smiled calmly. He raised his hand and the head of the man closest to him was chopped off on the spot, falling down the city wall. Blood immediately gushed out, startling the people on the side and causing them to scream again. Emo Shuyao was silent for a moment. Finally, he raised his head and said calmly, "Once Bian City is broken, I will kill you. This king wants to tear you to shreds." Long Yong didn't seem to care. If Bian City falls, then this old man's life will come to an end. Since I will die anyway, what difference does it make? What is Prince's answer? Emo Shuyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. He said in a low voice, "I's answer is..." Whoosh. Emo Shuyao turned around and took a bow and arrow from the hands of a soldier next to him. Drawing the bow and releasing the arrow, he completed the entire set of actions in an instant. Everyone watched in a daze as the arrow with a silver light streaked across the sky and sank into the chest of a young man on the city wall. Emo Shuyao threw the bow and arrow back and said in a low voice, "Attack the city." Once the order was given, the sounds of killing rose again. The first to be affected were the innocent people on the city wall. Amidst the sounds of killing and crying, Emo Shuyao turned around and left indifferently, leaving behind a cold figure and a low and gloomy voice. "Long Yong, I want all the people in your city to be buried with you." The fierce siege continued without rest. This time, both sides understood that it was no longer a small fight like a few days ago. Unless one side was defeated and the other side was victorious, there would be no rest. Perhaps because of the hundreds of innocent Dechu state people on the city wall, the Mahist army's attack became even more dauntless. After a few hours, Bian City's defense finally showed signs of decline. Chapter 667. In the city, Long Yong was sitting in an empty room with a gloomy look. He knew that Zhu Yan was dead. It wouldn't be long before Bian City was broken. Perhaps it was his fortune to be able to fight on the battlefield in his old age. However, such an inexplicable fiasco made it difficult for him to face it. One of his biggest mistakes was that he heard Emo Shuyao's words clearly when he left. The whole city was buried with him. Emo Shuyao wanted to massacre the city. Long Yong didn't doubt Emo Shuyao's words. When he was young, he had massacred a city before. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been called the god of killing in the western region. In fact, if he was young, he might not think that it was a big deal for Emo Shuyao to want to massacre a city. But now he was old after all. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Bian City. If Emo Shuyao really massacred the whole city, General. The soldier outside the door came in a hurry to report. Long Yong opened his eyes and said indifferently, "What's the matter?" The soldier said, "The East City can't be defended. General, please retreat as soon as possible." Retreat? Long Yong frowned and asked, "Who said to retreat?" Perhaps Long Yang's tone was too harsh. The soldier reported carefully, "It's Prince Genom of Gojoseon. Genom of Gojoseon said that Bian City can't be defended. He wants to retreat to Rongqing behind to stop the Mahist army." Long Yong shook his head and smiled bitterly. Even Bian City can't stop the Mahist army. How can Rongqing, that fragile city wall, stop the Mahist army? Stupid. The whole army stays and fights with the Mahist army in the city. Maybe we can take down half of the Mahist army. Many times fighting in the city was filled with people's lives. It had little to do with tactics. Moreover, they could take the initiative in the city. The Mahist army and the Xiling army were not too different in ability. At least Long Yong was confident that 2 Xiling soldiers could definitely deal with 1 Mahist army. In this way they could at least wipe out half of the Mahist army in Bian City. Only then would the defending army behind be able to hold back the Mahist army. The soldier looked at Long Yong hesitantly and said, "But Crown Prince Genom of Gojoseon has already retreated with his troops. What? Long Yang suddenly stood up and the soldier quickly said, Prince Genom of Gojoseon said that if we let the Mahist army enter the city, it will be too late. He has already led the remaining 100,000 soldiers and is preparing to withdraw from the west gate. Long Yang quickly walked out the door and said, Idiot. There are still tens of thousands of Mahist army soldiers guarding the small town ahead. Where does he think he can retreat to? But when Long Yang arrived at the west city, he could only see the Shilling army's horse hooves and smoke in the distance. Lei Tingfeng had brought along the Shilling army's most elite and most complete army of more than 100,000. The moment these men and horses withdrew, the originally sturdy defense instantly opened up a few large holes, and the Mo family army surged into the city like a tide. Under the west gate, Long Yang tiredly closed his eyes and sighed in a low voice, Zhu Yan, we are all finished. Although Lei Tingfeng took most of the people away, the Shilling soldiers were not just for show. It was already noon the next day when the Mahist army completely took over the entire Bian city. After a day and night of continuous fighting, even the Mo family army soldiers who were known for their bravery and fighting prowess were exhausted. Their eyes were bloodshot and their bodies were exhausted. When the Shilling defenders in the city were finally eliminated, the soldiers burst into cheers. Many people directly sat down on the street and fell asleep under the eaves. At noon the sun was shining brightly. Mo Xiuyao and his people just stepped into Bian city. Looking at the corpses of the two armies lying on the street, many soldiers on both sides of the street directly sat down and fell asleep. Mo Xiuyao waved his hand to stop the people around him who wanted to report loudly. As he walked past the corpses he asked in a low voice, Where's Long Yang? Shuijing whispered, Long Yang is in an empty house in the west of the city. There are already people guarding there. In addition, Long Yang has released many people in the city. Maybe it was because Mo Xiuyao said that he would bury all the people in the city with him. Yesterday night Long Yang opened the gate of the west city and let many people out of the city. The Mahist army had strict military discipline. Although Mo Xiuyao said that he did not officially order a massacre in the city. So as long as the soldiers in the battle were not obstructed by ordinary people, they would not attack ordinary people. Last night about half of the people had escaped. Mo Xiuyao shook his head carelessly. Let's go see Long Yang. How is the consort? Shuijing said, Last night Lei Tingfeng retreated with his people and fought with General Zhang in the west. He took about 20 to 30,000 people and rushed over. The consort ordered a pause in the pursuit. The army will reorganize in Bian City for 2 days. The consort should be back in a while. Hearing this, Mo Xiuyao's gloomy eyes flashed with a trace of warmth. He said lightly, Order people to clean up the battlefield and let the soldiers rest. Go and bring Long Yang here. Yes, Prince. Shuijing received the order and left. Mo Xiuyao turned and went to the governor's mansion in Bian City. The governor's mansion had already been taken care of. Originally, the battle in the city did not affect the mansion too much. The civil officials in Bian City who had not yet escaped had been locked up here by the Mahist army. Seeing Mo Xiuyao come in, the West Hill officials all had different expressions. Some were begging, some were unyielding, some were fearful, and some were hostile. Mo Xiuyao did not have the heart to pay attention to them. He waved his hand and ordered people to take them away. Not long after he sat down to rest, the guard outside came in to report, Prince Long Yang is here. Mo Xiuyao opened his eyes. They were filled with coldness. Let him in. Not long after Long Yang strolled in. Shuijing followed behind him but did not order people to hold him. Long Yang was still dressed in white coarse clothes. He looked much older and more tired than he had a few days ago. At first glance he looked like an ordinary old man from the mountains. There was no trace of the ruthless look on his face when he used innocent people as meat shields on the city gate tower. Mo Xiuyao looked at him calmly and said lightly, General Fengwen, nice to meet you. Chapter 668. Prince Ding, nice to meet you. Long Yang hit the man in front of him for a long time before he finally spat out a few words. This was the first time Long Yang had seen the world-famous Prince Ding. From a certain point of view, Mo Xiuyao's fame was even greater than that of his father Mo Lufeng, who had made outstanding contributions to the Dechu state. Because he had done something that Prince Ding had never done in the past few generations of Prince Ding. That was to sever all ties with the Dechu state. From then on, the Mahist army and Prince Ding had truly become a power that contended for hegemony in this world. From then on, they had truly broken free from the shackles of the Dechu state. In the future, the success or failure of the Mahist army and the Dechu state would no longer have any relation. The man in front of him was dressed in snow-white clothes. His long white hair was casually draped over his shoulders. It was completely different from this bloody battlefield, but it made Long Yong feel a trace of danger. Long Yong believed in his intuition, even if he had not been on the battlefield for more than 20 years. The man in front of her was far from being as gentle as he appeared to be. Under the pure white snow of the sky and the white snow of the mountains, there was clearly a frightening stench of blood that surged. Emo Shuyao calmly looked at Long Yong. He casually played with the blue and white porcelain cup in his hand as he lightly said, "Originally, I wanted to have a good chat with General Long and General Zhu. But General Long, I have to say, I's mood right now is very bad. General Long, do you know what I hate the most in my life?" Long Yong looked at Emo Shuyao and said in a deep voice, "Prince Ding, please enlighten me." Emo Shuyao slowly put down the teacup. The sound of the teacup hitting the table echoed in the quiet room. "It's being threatened. What I hate the most in my life is being threatened by others. In addition, I am more curious as to why General I would give up on attacking the city for the sake of those people from Dechu State." Emo Shuyao slowly laughed as if he had said something funny. Long Yong was silent for a moment before he said, "I was wrong. It was probably because, when one got old, one's heart would soften. If this old man was young, I would have made the same decision as Prince Ding." Emo Shuyao nodded and smiled. As expected, General Long is the one who understands I the best. If that's the case, is General Long prepared to accept the consequences of your decision? Hearing this, Long Yang's expression changed and he said in a low voice, "Prince Ding, you've already taken down Bian City. Why do you still need to kill? This matter was done by this old man alone. If Prince Ding is angry, you might as well take this old man's life." Emo Shuyao smiled faintly and declined to comment. "I forgot to tell General Long that although General Long released most of the people in the city last night, but the Mahist army also captured many of the West Hills soldiers. Barely, it should be enough to make up for the number of people who escaped, right?" Prince Ding. Long Yong painfully closed his eyes. This old man will take responsibility for his own actions. Even if Prince Ding cuts this old man to pieces, this old man will not say a word. "Please, let the innocent people and soldiers go." Emo Shuyao acted as if he didn't hear him. He waved to the people at the door and smiled. "Take General Long Yong to see." Outside the door, Zhuo Jing waved his hand and 2 guards came in to take Long Yong out. In the room, Emo Shuyao slowly closed his eyes. After a long time, a low voice slowly came out from under his long white hair. "These people are really annoying. Father, big brother, wait until I kill them all, then you can rest in peace. Then no one will be able to hurt Li anymore." After Yi Li finished dealing with the matters on the battlefield, she brought Feng Jiao and the others back to Bian City. The Mahist army soldiers outside the city were sweeping the battlefield. There was a thick smell of blood in the air. A group of people walked on the streets of the city. From time to time, the soldiers who were cleaning the streets would come forward to salute them. Feng Jiao frowned and said with some confusion, "What is going on? Why is there not a single person in the city? Even if the battle had just ended and the people were afraid to go out, it shouldn't be to the point where there was not a single person. Even the windows on the 2 sides of the street didn't have anyone peeking out. The entire city was quiet. Other than the soldiers who were cleaning the streets, it was like a dead city." The soldier in front hesitated and looked at Yi Li and the others before reporting. Reporting to Wang Fei, "General Feng, Prince just ordered all the people and prisoners to be taken to the west side of the city." Yi Li frowned and asked, "Taken to the west side of the city? What for?" "Outside the west side of the city is the execution ground of Bian City." "Execution ground?" Feng Jiao thought for a while and said, "Which important general of West Hill has been captured? Long Yong or Lei Tingfeng?" "That's not right. Even if they were captured, there is no need to rush to execute them now, right? Killing Long Yong was not a big deal. It would be a blow to West Hill's morale. But Lei Tingfeng's identity was more valuable alive than dead." Young Master Feng felt dizzy and forgot that Lei Tingfeng had just slipped away from his hands last night. The soldier looked at Yi Li and didn't say anything. Yili frowned and said, "Tell me the truth." The soldier said in a low voice, "Prince ordered all the prisoners and people of Bian City to be killed." "What?" Yili and Feng Jiao were both shocked. They looked at each other. Feng Jiao steadied his mind and asked, "What is going on?" The soldier quickly explained the situation of the battle. Of course, it also included how Long Yang threatened them with the people of Dechu State in Bian City to withdraw their troops. They didn't have time to finish listening. The group hurried to the execution ground outside the west side of the city. There was a large open area outside the west side of the city. It had been the execution ground since Bian City was built. But there was no doubt that the number of people who would be beheaded here today would be more than the total number of people in Bian City in the past few hundred years. Long Yang was held down by two Qilin soldiers. He faced the execution ground and looked helplessly at the prisoners who were forced to kneel on the ground. Many of these people were still injured. But at this time they were forced to kneel on the ground and stick out their necks. The flat and cold bluestone ground was already stained with dark red blood. Obviously the people kneeling now were not the first batch. Long Yang was held down by the people behind him and couldn't move. His eyes were about to pop out. "Enough. Prince Ding. It's all this old man's fault. Kill me now." Long Yang's eyes were red and the veins on his forehead popped out. He was really wrong. In order to protect Bian City, he had unintentionally angered a bloodthirsty lion that had been dormant for many years. Perhaps it was because he had killed too many people when he was young that he decided to take revenge on these innocent soldiers and people in his old age. "Prince Ding. Kill this old man." Long Yang roared. Emo Xiuyao's lips curled into a smile. He raised his hand and pointed at the people in the pool of blood. "I won't kill you. General Long Yang, just watch. Look at these soldiers and how these people died. It was you who caused their deaths. When two armies fight, I never bring harm to the people. This time you forced I. After this, I believe that yesterday's situation will never happen again on the battlefield. Don't you think so? Killing innocent people like this, aren't you afraid of retribution?" Long Yang said in pain. If it was in the past, Long Yang didn't believe in retribution. He only believed that man could conquer nature. But now he had to admit that there was retribution in this world. Chapter 669. Emo Xiuyao raised an eyebrow and laughed lightly. "What retribution is I afraid of? The Prince Ding mansion has served the country loyally for generations. What good retribution have they received? Are Wang Fei and Shitzi Yi not afraid?" Long Yang said. When these words were said, Emo Xiuyao's frown instantly froze. Emo Xiuyao suddenly looked at Long Yang. That blood-filled gaze caused Long Yang's heart to tremble. He heard Emo Xiuyao say harshly, "Kill them." Turning back to look at Long Yang, Emo Xiuyao said coldly, "You better pray that Lili will be safe for the rest of her life, otherwise I will bury all the people in this world with her." Hearing Emo Xiuyao's order, the executioners on the execution ground once again raised the knives in their hands. "Stop." A clear female voice came from behind. Everyone's hands paused. They saw a white-robed figure land in the middle of the execution ground like a white cloud. Yili turned to look at the dark red blood at her feet and frowned. Then she looked at the sobbing commoners who had been brought to the execution ground and sighed in relief. There was still time. "Lili, why have you come?" Emo Xiuyao stilled and his cold face warmed. He stood up and asked gently as he looked at the white-robed figure on the execution ground. Yili raised her eyes and looked at the man with snow-white robes and snow-white hair on the high platform. Her handsome face had a faint warmth and gentleness. It was completely different from the cold and emotionless voice that sounded like an Azura. She led Feng Jiao onto the high platform. Feng Jiao was the first to experience his prince's knife-like gaze. He helplessly rubbed his nose and stood to the side. Wang Fei had come back at this time. It had nothing to do with him. "Lili, why have you come? Why don't you go back and rest after working so hard for so many days?" Emo Xiuyao asked unhappily when he saw the tiredness on Yili's face. Yili helplessly rolled her eyes at him. Who was the one who caused her to not be able to go back to rest? "What's going on? Why did you suddenly?" Yili asked in a low voice. If possible, she didn't want to ask Emo Xiuyao about it in this place. But now was not the time to choose a place for her. If he hesitated, the heads of nearly 100,000 people would roll. In both her past and present life, Yili was still a soldier. She was not afraid of war, nor was she afraid of death. However, killing prisoners and innocent civilians was clearly not within her moral bottom line. Moreover, this would damage the reputation of Mo Shuyao and the Maoist army. A few years ago, Mo Shuyao had killed thousands of Dechu state soldiers in the northwest. This had already caused many scholars to criticize him. If the citizens of the city were added, then it really wasn't a good thing for Mo Shuyao. Mo Shuyao slightly knit his brows and said in a low voice, "Lili, you don't need to care about these things. Go back and rest first, okay? When I finish dealing with these things, I will go back to accompany you. We can rest in Bian City for 2 days." Shuyao. Facing Mo Shuyao's obvious desire to change the topic, Yili quietly looked at him with a trace of worry in her eyes. "Shuyao, I'm a bit tired. Can you accompany me back to rest first? We can talk about these things another day," Yili said softly. Her voice was weak and tired. Mo Shuyao's heart softened. He lowered his head and looked at Yili's dark eyes. Finally, he bent down and picked up Yili and walked out. Yili leaned into Mo Shuyao's arms and raised her head to give Feng Zhiyao a meaningful look. Feng Zhiyao nodded slightly, indicating that she would leave it to him. Only then did he rest assured and close his eyes against Mo Shuyao. She really was a bit tired after these few days. Mo Shuyao carried Yili past the execution ground. His gaze lightly swept over the kneeling West Hill soldiers. A trace of disdain and ridicule flashed through his cold eyes. Among these West Hill soldiers, there was no lack of staunch and unyielding people. After being defeated and captured, they were already prepared to die. Now that they saw Mo Shuyao's mocking gaze, how could they endure it? One of them fiercely spat and sneered, "Surnamed Mo, if you want to kill me, then kill me. 20 years later, I will be a good man again. I will definitely slaughter everyone in your Prince Ding mansion." Mo Shuyao's eyes were cold. He said lightly, "Since that is the case, I will fulfill your wish. Kill them all." After that, he no longer paid attention to the people in front of him. Carrying Yili, he strolled out of the execution ground. The people who stayed behind looked at each other. The Wangfei clearly meant that they were not allowed to kill, but the prince wanted them all to be killed. To kill or not to kill became a problem. Logically speaking, they should naturally listen to the prince's orders. But in these years, the prince had never gone against the Wangfei's wishes. Furthermore, the soldiers of the Mo family army were the most elite soldiers, and every one of them had the pride of a soldier. Killing people on the battlefield was one thing. They really could not bear to slaughter ordinary people who had no power to resist. "General Feng, what should we do?" The general supervising the execution came forward and asked. Feng Zhiyao touched his chin and pondered for a moment. He used his chin to point at the group of people who were still kneeling on the execution ground and said, "Kill them all. Leave the rest for now." The prince said to kill them all. Those who insulted and cursed Prince Ding deserved to die. But the 100 people who were with him were pitiful. They could only think of it as their bad luck. Those kneeling on the execution ground were all killed. As for the rest, of course they would have to wait for the Prince's Wangfei's orders. Feng Zhiyao thought silently. The general supervising the execution satisfied and went to carry out the order. Feng Zhiyao looked at the ashen-faced Long Yang and secretly shook his head. Long Yang had also violated Mo Shuyao's taboo. He had used the people of Dechu state as meat shields. If Mo Shuyao retreated once, the West Hill generals behind him would follow suit. More importantly, there were nearly 1,000 Qilin who had entered the city first. If Mo Shuyao really gave the order to retreat, Long Yang would free up his hands and the nearly 1,000 Qilin who had entered the city first would suffer. But wasn't His Highness a little too angry? Yili woke up from a deep sleep. It was already dark outside. She sat up and rubbed her eyebrows. Something was wrong. Although she was very tired, it was not to the extent that she would fall asleep right after being held in Mo Shuyao's arms. She suddenly remembered what had happened at the execution ground. Yili looked up and saw Mo Shuyao sitting under the lamp outside the gauze screen, writing. As if he had heard Yili's figure, Mo Shuyao put down his pen and walked into the room. He smiled and said, "You're awake?" Yili nodded and looked at Mo Shuyao carefully. Under the light of the night pearl, his handsome face had a faint smile, gentle and comfortable. Yili leaned into his arms and looked up at his tired face. She said softly, "Why don't you rest for a while? Aren't we going to stay in Bian City for 2 days? If there's anything, we can deal with it tomorrow." Mo Shuyao rested his chin on her head. He stroked her soft hair and smiled faintly. I can't sleep. I'll deal with everything I need to deal with so that I can accompany you tomorrow. Li, you've worked hard these days. For some reason, Yili suddenly remembered Zhu Ling's expression before he died. His white clothes were stained with blood, lying on the ground stained with blood. His eyes were dim. The smile on her face gradually faded. Yili closed her eyes with a headache. What's wrong, Li? Emo Shuyao asked softly. Chapter 670. It's nothing. Yili said in a low voice, I'm just a little tired. Emo Shuyao's eyes moved slightly. He gently patted her delicate back and said in a gentle voice, since you're tired, then sleep a little longer. Let's talk about it tomorrow, okay? Yili nodded. Leaning against Emo Shuyao's chest really did make her feel a little drowsy. Forcing herself to stay awake, Yili said in a low voice, Shuyao, the war has nothing to do with the people. Don't kill the innocent, the people's hearts. Emo Shuyao lowered his head and looked at the beautiful face that was gradually falling into a deep sleep. He lowered his head and gently kissed her. Li's heart is too soft. This is not good. It will be very easy for others to hurt you. Who in this world is innocent? In the temporary study of the governor's office, Emo Shuyao sat in a chair. His expression was indifferent as he looked at Feng Jiao and Qin Feng in front of him. Feng Jiao felt extremely helpless in his heart. However, he did not dare to provoke Emo Shuyao when his mood was obviously very bad. The originally lazy and leisurely smile on his face gradually became a stiff fake smile. In the end, he could not maintain it any longer. Looking at Qin Feng, who clearly had no intention of speaking, Feng Jiao coughed lightly and said, Prince. Emo Shuyao raised his eyes and looked at him indifferently. He asked, have you finished dealing with the people on the execution ground? It's done. Feng Jiao quickly replied. Finished? Emo Shuyao raised his eyebrows and laughed coldly. Then what are the people in the captive camp outside the city? Feng Jiao smiled apologetically and said, the person who insulted Prince and the person who was kneeling on the execution ground were all killed. Prince is very clear. As for the rest, didn't Prince not give any orders? Emo Shuyao tilted his head and looked at him with a half-smile. He asked, then I will give the order now. Go and kill them all. Prince. Feng Jiao's face was bitter as he whispered, Prince, please reconsider. Emo Shuyao looked at him coldly. Feng Jiao continued, Prince, our Mahist army has strict military discipline. We never kill innocent people. If the prince killed these people in a fit of anger, the reputation of the Mahist army and the Prince Ding mansion would be ruined. Moreover, the people of West Hill were brave. If they knew that the Mahist army had massacred the city, they would definitely help the defenders of West Hill to defend the city. It will also be very disadvantageous for our future battles. Looking at Emo Xuyao's unmoved appearance, Feng Jiao sighed in his heart. He could only continue. Moreover, the consort is kind and will not agree with the prince's actions. Why would the prince make the consort unhappy for irrelevant people? At this point, Feng Jiao raised his eyes and stole a glance at Emo Shuyao. Seeing that he was frowning and thinking, Feng Jiao was slightly relieved. If the prince did not care and insisted on killing those people, then no one would be able to persuade him. After a long while, Emo Shuyao said coldly, kill all the captives and drive all the ordinary people out of the city. Feng Sen, if you do not do it well, then do as you see fit. Feng Jiao sighed in relief. In this era there was no such thing as not killing captives. Captives captured on the battlefield could only be exchanged or used as slaves. Otherwise they were usually killed. Although Feng Jiao did not care to kill the defenseless West Hill soldiers, he knew that these people could not be released. It would be troublesome to keep them alive. If Emo Shuyao insisted on killing them, then he did not care. Yes, sir. Feng Jiao said respectfully. Looking at Emo Shuyao, he asked, Prince Long Yong, how should we deal with him? Emo Shuyao's face darkened at the mention of Long Yong. With a gloomy expression, he said, take Long Yong to the execution ground. Let him see how those West Hill soldiers die. Feng Jiao finally understood why Long Yong had appeared at the execution platform during the day. He shook his head in his heart. Long Yong had offended the prince too much. No one could persuade him. Sir, go and do it now. Don't let the consort know. Emo Shuyao added slowly. Feng Jiao and Qin Feng looked at each other. This kind of thing, Could they hide it? Yes, sir. After finishing, Emo Xiuyao had no intention of letting them leave. For a moment the two were confused. Emo Xiuyao stared at the two for a long time before asking, "What happened to Emo Xiuyao?" The two were stunned and did not understand what Emo Xiuyao meant. Emo Xiuyao frowned and said irritably, "Li has been in a bad mood. What happened this time?" The consort was in a bad mood? The two lowered their brows and thought for a moment. They could not think of anything that made the consort in a bad mood. The war had always been going smoothly. Although the Emo family army had suffered some losses, those were all unavoidable losses that were expected. Other than that, there wasn't much else. Seeing Emo Xiuyao's face getting worse and worse, Qin Feng said, "Zhu Ling, the grandson of General Zhu Yan, blocked a hidden weapon for the consort and died." General Zhu Yan jumped down from the tower in front of the consort and committed suicide. Qin Feng thought for a long time. Only these two things could be called special. Zhu Ling? Who is that? Emo Xiuyao asked. Qin Feng told the story from beginning to end. Originally, Yili and Qin Feng only went to help Zhang Qilan deal with Zhu Yan, who might come out, and the Jingguojun, who was hiding in an unknown place. After that, the matter of Yili, Lin Han and Lin Han sneaking into the Jingguo army's base alone was suddenly decided by Yili. She didn't tell Emo Xiuyao, so he naturally didn't know. The more he listened, the more gloomy Emo Xiuyao's face became. Feng Zhiyao, who was standing next to him, could not help but take 2 steps back. When Qin Feng finished, the study was silent. Feng Zhiyao bitterly waited for Emo Xiuyao's predictable anger to hit. After waiting for a long time, he heard Emo Xiuyao's calm voice. "I know. You can go out." Oh. Feng Zhiyao was stunned. Qin Feng glanced at him coldly and turned to go out. Feng Zhiyao trembled and hurriedly rushed out as well. In the study, only Emo Xiuyao was left alone, facing the lonely lamp on the table. Zhu Ling, a dead person still makes Li upset. He died too easily. Chapter 671. Early in the morning, Bian City had already returned to its usual peaceful and leisurely state, but it was no longer as bustling and noisy as before. Other than the patrolling Mahist army soldiers, the streets were empty. There were no noisy people or vendors, no open shops or restaurants on both sides of the street. The huge Bian City seemed incomparably quiet and empty. Emo Xiuyao had been invited to the study by Zhang Qilan and the others early in the morning. Yili took advantage of the free time to take Shuijing, Lin Han, and Qin Feng to walk around the city. Looking at the empty streets, she was silent for a moment before asking, "Yesterday those people on the execution ground?" Qin Feng and the others looked at each other. Qin Feng said, reporting to Wang Fei, "Prince has ordered all the citizens to be expelled from Bian City." Hearing this, Yili let out a sigh of relief. No matter what, it was good that the city wasn't massacred. Expelled from Bian City? Where did those people go? Yili asked after thinking about it. Qin Feng said, "They managed to keep their lives, so it's good to go anywhere. But Lei Tingfeng's army has been defeated and only 20 to 30,000 people are retreating to the west. Those citizens are also going in that direction. I'm afraid that many of them will be incorporated into Lei Tingfeng's army. When the time comes when they go to the battlefield." Yili said lightly, "When they go to the battlefield, they are the enemy. Spread the news that Long Yang used to choose state citizens as meat shields at the top of Bian City. It doesn't matter if the news is exaggerated." The three looked at Yili in confusion. Yili said, "The matter of the prisoners and the prince wanting to kill the citizens cannot be hidden. With this reason, it will be better for the prince and the Mahist army's reputation. Once the news of Long Yang using Dechu state citizens as meat shields spread, Emo Xiuyao's actions would be easier to understand. Whether it was revenge or a moment of anger, it was fine. It was easy for people to overlook Emo Xiuyao's actions. Besides, Prince Ding didn't massacre the entire city in the end." Shuijing answered and went to handle the matter. Yili continued to walk forward with Qin Feng and Lin Han. "Where's Long Yang?" Qin Feng hesitated for a moment, then said, "It's in the prison on the west side of the city. Prince ordered a large number of soldiers to guard it." "Let's go take a look," Yili said softly. Emo Xiuyao really hated Long Yang. The place where Long Yang was locked up was not a sturdy prison. Instead, it was a small building facing the execution ground in the western part of the city. From the window of the small building, One could see the execution ground outside the city. No one knew how many people had been killed in the execution ground outside the city last night. But Long Yong definitely knew because he was forced to watch the captives die one by one from the beginning to the end. Even after the execution, Mo Shuyao found him a prison cell that didn't face the execution ground. The smell of blood from the execution ground could probably be smelled all night. The soldiers guarding the building didn't stop Yili. Yili waved her hand to stop the others from following. Only Qin Feng and Lin Han stepped into the small building. They hadn't seen each other for one night, but Long Yong was completely different from yesterday. Long Yong, who was already 70 years old, finally bent his back, which was still healthy and strong, down. The frown on his face had deepened overnight. At a glance, it was as if he had aged more than 10 years. His sparse white hair was scattered messily on his head. His old, turbid eyes were dim and lifeless. Anyone could see that Long Yong was in great pain. His pain had nothing to do with his body. It was his heart that was tormented by guilt and regret. He was already an old man in his 70s. He was no longer as cold-hearted and murderous as he was when he was young. Seeing the soldiers of Xiling die one by one because of his mistakes, he hated that he couldn't take their place. Cough cough. Princess Ding? Hearing the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, Long Yong turned around with some difficulty. He saw a young woman standing at the top of the stairs. A beautiful woman in a green dress. She didn't have the aura of pearls and jade, nor did she have the grace and nobility of brocade. Her beautiful face was calm, but there was a kind of majesty that ordinary ladies and noblewomen couldn't compare to. Long Yong didn't expect that the world-famous Princess Ding would be a young woman who wasn't even 20 years old. But in a place like Bian City, a woman who could come and go freely and with such an aura could only be the king's consort. Yili nodded and said softly, "General Long Yong, nice to meet you." Long Yong smiled bitterly. How can it be nice to meet a defeated general? Yesterday. Thank you for saving the lives of the people of Bian City. I didn't do it for the people of Bian City. Yili walked to a chair not far from Long Yong and sat down. Long Yong shook his head and said, "No matter what, it's a fact that consort saved them. This old man. Old madam is muddle-headed and almost killed these innocent people. This old man naturally has to thank consort." Saying this, Long Yong stood up and bowed to Yili. He was already a person who was about to die, so he didn't care much about fame and fortune. He didn't feel that it was shameful to bow to a young woman in her early 20s. Yili was startled. She glanced at Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing, who were standing to the side. The two of them hurriedly came forward and helped Long Yong to his left and right, sending him back to the chair he had been sitting in. Long Yong sat down to catch his breath. Then he looked at Yili and said, "For consort to come at this time, is there something you want to say to this old man?" Long Yang's spirit and physical strength were very poor. Not only was he tired these days, but he also spent the whole night looking out of the window at the execution ground. The 70-year-old man was exhausted to the extreme. Even if the Mahist army didn't hurt Long Yong and didn't even eat the slightest bit of food, Long Yang's face and body still became extremely weak. Yili nodded and pondered for a moment before saying, "General Zhu Yan and Zhu Ling have died in the battle." Long Yong smiled helplessly and said, "This? I have already expected this. Zhu Yan has been copying people's hearts all his life. After 20 years of suffocation, it's a good thing for him to die on the battlefield. He is luckier than me. It's just a pity for Zhu Ling. That boy was thrown into the Jinghua army by his grandfather when he was just 10 years old. After more than 10 years of hard work, he took over the command of the Jinghua army, but I didn't expect." Shaking his head and sighing, Long Yong looked at Yili and said, "I heard that consort defeated Lei Tingfeng's hundreds of thousands of troops by yourself. We thought that Lei Tingfeng was used to being arrogant, so he was defeated. Now it seems that I am the arrogant one. Consort is no worse than a famous general. I admire you for being able to find the Jinghua army in just a few days. It's just a small trick. General, you flatter me." After a moment of silence in the small building, Long Yong asked, "How did Zhu Yan die?" "General Zhu died for his country after the city was broken." Yili whispered, "Well, he died for a good reason." Long Yong nodded. Looking at Yili, he said, "In fact, even if consort didn't come today, I still wanted to see consort." Yili said in a low voice, "General Long Yong, if you have anything to say, just say it." Long Yang sighed and looked out of the window at the empty execution ground not far away. He said, "Consort must have heard that when I was young, I was also a cruel and merciless person who killed without blinking an eye." Yi Li nodded and said, "Yes, General Long Yang's name is not only famous in the western region, but also in the Central Plains." Chapter 672. Long Yang shook his head. "What killing god of the West? When I was young I didn't believe in the heavens, gods or fate. I killed many people. Now that I've been idle for more than 20 years I know my mistakes. However, I never thought that this old man's sins of killing would actually be reflected in my old age. This old man lost his wife in his middle age, and in his later years he was all alone without any children. There must be some reasons." Yi Li was silent for a moment. She looked up at Long Yang and said, "I understand General Long Yang's meaning." Long Yang nodded. "Although I'm old I still have a good eye for people. Wang Fei has a peaceful nature and is not a bloodthirsty person. But Prince Ding, although I've only met him a few times, Prince Ding's brows seem calm and indifferent. In fact, his brows are like knives and his eyes are filled with killing intent. I'm afraid it's not a good omen. I heard that Wang Fei came from a famous scholarly family in Dechu State. You should know that war between two armies is inevitable. But wantonly killing innocent people is against the harmony of the heavens." Yi Li frowned. There was some displeasure in her eyes. She said lightly, "General Long, Prince Ding didn't hurt anyone in Bian City." Looking at Yi Li's displeasure, Long Yang smiled and nodded. "That's why I have to thank Wang Fei. If it weren't for Wang Fei, I'm afraid that Bian City would be covered in rivers of blood right now." Yi Li frowned and asked, "What does General Long Yang want to say to me?" Long Yang looked at Yi Li and said in a low voice, "Wang Fei, please advise Prince Ding. The number of casualties on the battlefield is the will of the heavens. But killing innocent people outside of the battlefield is what a ruler should do." Yi Li's heart moved slightly. She looked at Long Yang calmly. Long Yang looked out the window with a disappointed expression. When a person is about to die, his words are kind. I'm not saying this for Xiling. It's purely what I've gained in half my life. If he allowed the blood to cover his eyes, there would be a day when his heart would be covered by the blood. Since ancient times, the battlefield has been a place that can turn living people into ghosts. Yi Li lowered her eyes, but her mind was in a mess. She understood what Long Yang meant. The battlefield was indeed a place where it was easy to magnify one's evil thoughts to the maximum. Yi Li had always known that Immerse was not what he appeared to be. Whether it was the initial gentleness and elegance or the indifference and coldness. Or was it the occasional willful mischief that came later, carefree and unrestrained? How could a person who had suffered such a heavy blow and hurt, who had endured humiliation for so many years, and whose personality had completely changed, be so calm? At least if it was her, she wouldn't be able to do it. Immerse had hatred in his heart, but he was able to suppress it. His heart was filled with hatred, but he could only watch as Jingqi died in front of him. He didn't do anything to take revenge. This made it easy for people to think that his hatred was not deep, or that he had gradually opened up his mind. But Yi Li knew that Immerse had never been a broad-minded person who would repay evil with good. This time, Immerse's sudden outburst was actually unreasonable. Long Yang's action of using the people of Dechu State as meat shields was wrong. But if it was a normal person, they would have caught Long Yang and cut him into pieces to vent their anger. But Immerse wanted Long Yang to live. He wanted to see the West Hill soldiers and even the West Hill people die one by one. He wanted Long Yang to live a life worse than death. He wasn't angry at Long Yang's actions, but he hated Long Yang an extreme hatred. But in reality, there was no hatred between Long Yang and Immerse. There was no hatred in a fight on the battlefield. Long Yang could see all this, so Yi Li could naturally understand. So Long Yang was regretting. He didn't really regret using the people as meat shields. He regretted that his actions had drawn out Immerse's murderous intent, and even possibly unleashed a bloodthirsty demon. Yi Li looked at the old man in front of her, whose eyes were filled with worry. She said seriously, "He won't become that kind of person. He will be very good." Long Yang nodded and said, "This old man believes that Princess can do it. To have Princess Ding as his wife is Prince Ding's fortune." Yi Li smiled sweetly and said softly, "To be able to meet him is also my fortune." It didn't matter who was whose fortune. But Yili believed that Emo Xiuyao was the right person for her. Even if there were people in the world more handsome than Emo Xiuyao, more powerful and more capable than Emo Xiuyao, there was only one Emo Xiuyao. At this point the two of them looked at each other and smiled. The atmosphere in the small building was so peaceful that it didn't seem like it was between the two sides. Yili was about to speak when the sound of steady footsteps came from downstairs. Qin Feng, who was standing at the top of the stairs, looked downstairs and gestured to Yili. Yili stood up and walked to the top of the stairs. The person downstairs had already come up. Seeing Yili, he was slightly startled. He smiled and said, "Li." Yili reached out and grasped Emo Xiuyao's hand, pulling him into the small building. She smiled and said, "Why are you here?" Emo Xiuyao lowered his head to look at her and said softly, "After dealing with official business, I wanted to take you out for a walk. They said you came out." Yili smiled and said, "I had nothing to do this morning, so I came out for a walk. I also wanted to pay a visit to General Long. You've been busy so early in the morning. Why don't you sit down and rest for a while?" Seeing Long Yang sitting by the window, Emo Xiuyao's half-closed eyes flashed with a trace of coldness. However, he didn't have any intention of disobeying Yili. He allowed her to pull him to sit down next to her. The two of them, who couldn't wait to kill each other yesterday, sat together. Naturally, there was nothing to talk about. Emo Xiuyao also didn't have any intention of talking to Long Yang. He just acted as if he didn't exist. He pulled Yili's hand and asked softly, "Li, do you have any place you want to go? We'll be leaving in 2 days. I heard that there are a few places in Bian City that are really worth seeing." Yili smiled and said, "Whatever place you think is good, we'll go take a look. If I remember correctly, Longshan Academy is in the city?" Emo Xiuyao frowned slightly. He nodded with some displeasure and said, "That's right. It's a pity that several of the famous teachers of Longshan Academy were taken away by Lei Tingfeng. They only left behind a few scholars. They said that they didn't have time to take away some ancient books. Lily can take a look and see if there's anything you like. Later on, you can have someone send it back to grandfather and uncles." Yili smiled and said, "You're still the most considerate. However, just pick a few that grandfather and uncles will like. The rest will be left in Bian City. They'll be useful in the future." Of course, it wasn't to return them to the people of Longshan Academy. Since the Mahist army had occupied Bian City, if they wanted to rule for a long time, it was impossible for them to not have people. Although Emo Xiuyao had expelled all the people of Bian City, there would still be people here in the future. Longshan Academy was one of the 3 great academies in the world. If it was restored, it would be very beneficial for the Prince Ding Mansion's rule. Emo Xiuyao naturally understood Yili's meaning. He smiled and said, "Whatever Lili says is fine. However, if Lili is interested in Longshan Academy, there's still one person in Bian City. I'll have someone bring her to see Lili later." Yili was somewhat helpless. What did he mean by she was interested in Longshan Academy? However, she was somewhat interested in Emo Xiuyao's words. She raised her eyebrows and asked, "Which madam of Longshan Academy has stayed in Bian City and hasn't left?" Chapter 673. Emo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. Longshan Academy's headmaster, Mr. Xiuting Qin Xiufu. Hearing this, not only Yili but even Long Yang showed a trace of surprise. Mr. Xiuting's name was far less famous than Mr. Qingyun and the Su family, but this did not mean that Mr. Xiuting's talent was inferior to Mr. Qingyun's. But compared to Dechu State, Xiling had always valued martial prowess and despised literature. There were not as many literati as Dechu State, and the status of literati was not as high as Dechu State's. And this Mr. Xiuting indeed did not involve himself in politics. He only focused on teaching and educating people. Xiling, in the eyes of the people of the Central Plains, was not much different from Nanzhao and Beirong, but it was able to make Longshan Academy one of the 3 great academies. This was enough to prove Mr. Xiuting's talent and knowledge. Longshan Academy and Lishan Academy had different ancient legacies. Longshan Academy had been developed by Mr. Xiuting. Why is this Mr. Xiuting still in Bian City? Why is he still here? Yili asked curiously. Emo Xiuyao nodded and smiled. Of course. Even if he really wanted to kill everyone in Bian City, he had not really lost his mind. He knew what kind of people he could not kill or let go. And in this Bian City there were only a few people with such value. Before Bian City had been conquered, Emo Xiuyao had already ordered Qilin to control them. Even if they left first, they could not leave. Shall we go and take a look? Emo Xiuyao asked softly. I heard that Mr. Xiaoting is quite troublesome. Yili also stood up. They would not stay in Bian City for long, so naturally they had to seize the time to take a look. Emo Xiuyao let go of Yi Li's hand and smiled. I still have a few words to say to General Long Yang. Can Miss Li go down and wait for me? Yi Li glanced at Long Yang, who was sitting by the window. She nodded and said softly, I'll wait for you downstairs. Emo Xiuyao only turned to look at Long Yang through the window when the footsteps had completely disappeared. The gentle smile on his face had long disappeared without a trace, and his gloomy eyes were filled with a sharp and murderous aura. If I hear you talking nonsense with Li Li again, I will definitely make you regret it. Although he didn't hear what Long Yang said to Li, the worry that flashed across Li's eyes when he came up didn't escape Emo Xiuyao's eyes. Long Yang must have said something to Li that he shouldn't have said, which made Li worried about him. Long Yang looked calmly at him without the heart-wrenching pain and hatred from yesterday. He smiled faintly and said, Prince Ding is very fortunate to have such a Wang Fei. Emo Xiuyao snorted coldly and stared darkly at him. Long Yang shook his head and said with a smile, Prince, don't worry. What can this old man say to Wang Fei? It's just a casual chat. Also, we don't have to see each other again. Speaking of this, Long Yang sighed with melancholy. Emo Xiuyao stared at Long Yang for a moment and then suddenly laughed in a low voice. Long Yang, don't count on Lei Zhenting coming back. Even if he comes back, he can't save Xiling. I have 400,000 soldiers waiting for him at the border. There are also the hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers from Nanzhao. Do you think those soldiers have the time to come back? And the small countries of the western regions that you suppressed in the past, do you think they will take this chance to take revenge? Xiling is hopeless. Long Yang was stunned and only recovered after a while. He finally laughed helplessly, but his laughter was incomparably bleak and dispirited. As expected of Prince Ding, years of planning. As expected, it's fine if you don't act, but once you act, it's extraordinary. Forget it. This old man is old and should die. In the future, this old man will not care. Prince Ding, please. Outside the door downstairs, seeing Emo Xiuyao stroll out, Yi Li smiled and went up to greet him. Emo Xiuyao wrapped an arm around her slender waist and said in a low voice, Are we going to visit Sir Xiaoting now? Yi Li blinked and asked worriedly, Sir Xiaoting really won't chase us out? Scholars always had some pride in their bones. With Emo Xiuyao's actions in Bian City, Yi Li would not be surprised if Sir Xiaoting directly charged at them with a knife, much less chase them out. Emo Xiuyao snorted and walked forward with Yi Li. Who dares? Yi Li turned her head to glance at the small building with the windows still open and asked, What did you say to General Long Yang? What do you plan to do with him? Emo Xiuyao's eyes flashed slightly and he smiled faintly. Tell him not to speak nonsense to Li in the future. Li does not need to worry about me. Yi Li was startled and reached out to take the hand around her waist. She said softly, I'm not worried. No matter what, we will be together. Emo Xiuyao's expression relaxed and the smile on his face became even warmer. We do not worry. I have no interest in arguing with a half-dead old man. As long as he does not make a fuss, I will ignore him. Yi Li smiled faintly. In my eyes, are you not more important than him? Xiuyao, I do not care how you deal with him. As a soldier, Long Yang's devotion to the country was indeed worthy of her admiration. However, Long Yang's body was riddled with blood debts. Coupled with his actions in Bian City, even if Emo Xiuyao sentenced him to death, she wouldn't say anything. The fall of a famous general was a pity, but Long Yang was not innocent. The two walked further and further away until a soldier caught up from behind. With a panting voice he said, Prince Wang Fei. Long Yang set himself on fire. Yi Li was startled. What happened? Turning her head, they could no longer see the small room where Long Yang was imprisoned. But they could still see the thick smoke in that direction. The soldier paused and said, General Long Yang poured wine on himself and set himself on fire. You're tuning in to the Biao's Wuxiao Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.